And welcome back to the General Aviation Surface Safety Symposium. If you're just joining us, I would like to remind everyone that after every panel discussion, our panelists will answer a few questions from the audience. You can submit your questions at any time by using the Zoom Q&A button or by typing your question on Facebook or YouTube. You can also tweet at FAA News. Additionally, for any pilots who are seeking wings credit, please make sure you join the Zoom session that was listed in the SPAN's announcement. We cannot provide credit to those of you watching the live stream on YouTube. And now we'd like to show you a short video, a non-towered pilot simulator video on communications.
More than half of general aviation operations are conducted at non-towered airports, which includes when an airport's control tower is closed and air traffic services are not provided. As the pilot in command, you must know and understand operations at these airports. This three-part series focuses on communicating effectively and operating safely in the non-towered environment. Here in Part 1, we discussed basic radio communications. In Part 2, we'll dive deeper into VFR operations. In Part 3, we'll cover mixed VFR and IFR operations at non-towered airports. It is vitally important that pilots communicate properly and follow the prescribed operating procedures. This three-part series will provide best practices and help us all fly safely. Let's consider an example that includes a series of improper communication behaviors. See how many of these you can identify.
241, taking the active.
Bill, is that you? Have you talked to John? We're going to the lake this weekend if you'd like to come. We're your 5-7 Bravo on short final.
Yeah, you can count on Heather and me to show up. 241's turning upwind to crosswind.
We're your 5-7 Bravo, clear of the active.
Aaron 79er Whiskey, inbound from Quest. Any traffic in the pattern, please advise.
41's on downwind. 41 turning base for runway 20.
We're your 5-7 Bravo, line up and wait for runway 20.
Aaron 79er Whiskey, 2 mile final, full stop, runway 20.
Turning final for runway 20.
Clearly, this is not going well. How many errors did you catch? Let's listen again and identify them.
241, taking the active.
While talking on the published frequency, the pilot did not clearly state the airport name, aircraft call sign, aircraft location, or intentions. Use proper aviation phraseology. Begin with the airport name, followed by the word traffic, then aircraft make or model, aircraft call sign, and then state your location and intentions, and end by repeating the airport name. Taking the active is never proper aviation phraseology. You should always use the runway identifiers.
Bill, is that you? Have you talked to John? We're going to the lake this weekend if you'd like to come. We're your 5-7 Bravo on short final.
Yeah, you can count on Heather and me to show up. 241's turning upwind to crosswind.
We're your 5-7 Bravo, clear of the active.
Social conversations over the radio are distracting and should be avoided. To keep yourself and others safe, limit your communications to safety essential information. And again, active should not be used.
Aaron 79er Whiskey, inbound from Quest. Any traffic in the pattern, please advise.
The phrase, any traffic in the pattern, please advise, should not be used under any condition. While it is acceptable to give a fixed name, you should always include the distance in nautical miles and the direction from the airport. For example, 5 northeast.
We're your 5-7 Bravo, line up and wait for runway 20.
Line up and wait is not acceptable procedure at non-towered airports. Let's listen to the pilots again. this time using proper phraseology.
Westland traffic, Skyhawk 7241 Kilo, departing runway 20, closed traffic, Westland.
Westland traffic, Warrior 6057 Bravo, final, runway 20, full stop, Westland.
Westland traffic, Skyhawk 7241 Kilo, left crosswind, closed traffic, runway 20, Westland.
Westland traffic, Warrior 6057 Bravo, clear of runway 20, Westland.
Westland traffic, Baron 4079er Whiskey, 5 miles straight in, full stop, runway 20, Westland.
Westland traffic, Skyhawk 7241 Kilo, left downwind, touch and go, runway 20, Westland.
Westland traffic, Baron 4079er Whiskey, 2 mile final, runway 20, Westland.
Westland traffic, Skyhawk 7241 Kilo, extending downwind for the Baron, runway 20, Westland.
Westland traffic, Warrior 6057 Bravo, holding short, runway 20, Westland.
Remember, proper communication enhances safety for everyone. Click on the Resources tab. There you will find several safety resources.
Another excellent video in the series. And with that, I'd like to welcome back Bridget Singletanacool and Scott Proudfoot. And it looks like they have another FAA expert with them, Matt Porter. Matt, welcome. And Bridget and Scott, welcome back. The floor is y'all's.
Thank you, Jamal. I greatly appreciate it. We're actually going to transition. We were talking about a lot of wrong surface earlier this morning, and we're going to be talking more about runway incursions now. So if we could. Perfect. Let's go to the next slide here. All right, so really runway incursions by the numbers. So a lot of people probably don't realize how many takeoff and landings we actually have in the National Airspace System every year. We've got right around 50 million takeoff and landings in the National Airspace System. So last year you can see 52.5 million. And if you look at the preceding years before, it's always right around 50. So air traffic controllers submit approximately 300,000 mandatory occurrence reports. And that's not just on the ground, that's also in the air as well. So it's encompassing the entire National Airspace System. Of those 300,000 reports, about 20,000 of those, so about 20,000 are runway safety related. So there's some type of potential for a runway safety event. Now that could be a surface incident. So in other words, maybe an aircraft turned the wrong way on a taxiway or entered a taxiway without authorization. It could also be if we had a potential runway incursion or a runway excursion, right? So with all of those 20,000 mandatory occurrence reports that are somewhat related to runway safety, those are actually sent to quality assurance. So quality assurance is a line of business within the FAA. They actually receive these mandatory occurrence reports, they manually vet them, and if it has something to do with runway safety, then eventually they will send that event to runway safety. So quality assurance determines that it's a potential runway incursion, a surface incident, or an excursion, which typically is around 1,700 events a year. Then they send them to runway safety for processing. Matt, we were on that very last panel that we saw. So that was actually the first panel, but we as air traffic controllers are in the midst of a very large reporting culture. So reporting is really big for us because we want to learn, right? So we're always striving to get to that zero runway incursion number, even though 1,700 versus 52.5 million takeoff and landings in the NASA every year, considerably different. However, I, for one, know that I don't ever want to tell a pilot of a potential, and I'm going to highlight the word potential pilot deviation, but I know I started flying when I was 16. I subsequently got my first job at 16, probably some type of correlation, but I was super afraid of flight standards. So Matt, you're with flight standards. Can you speak more towards the compliance philosophy about or for flight standards, please?
Thank you, Bridget. And I can tell you when I started my training at the age of 18, the feeling was mutual. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about an MOR, mandatory occurrence report. This may be a new term to some of you all, but in tangible terms, an MOR is a description of what occurred that, or something that occurred that was not expected. A vast majority of the potential pilot deviations, they begin as MORs. We talked about how flight standards investigates those. So that is that is a report that we receive from air traffic of the potential pilot deviation that we conduct the investigation. And of course, a runway incursion is only one type of a potential pilot deviation that we receive. Back over to you, Bridget or Scott.
Thanks, Matt. So I will say that flight standards is much more of a kinder, gentler member of the FAA, line of business within the FAA than was when I originally started flying. And I recognize that, and hopefully somebody, maybe on a panel this afternoon, can talk about the compliance piece. Or the compliance philosophy piece, because a lot of this has to do with education. So if you have a pilot deviation and you end up talking with somebody in flight standards, then you have that ability to become educated more on what took place. So there's more of a training component around that, which was a lot different than when I started off. So I'm very happy to see that changeover. Again, I wanted to kind of talk about that 52.5 million takeoff and landings in the NAS. So out of that 52.5 million, so there's 52.5 million opportunities for a mistake. We had 1,713 runway incursions. About half of those runway incursions, half of that 1,700 are non-conflict events. So in other words, really whether it's a vehicle operator or a pilot, they cross the line without authorization and there's nobody else around. Okay. So all of that means is day in and day out, we all as a team, right? We're doing an amazing job, but there's always room for improvement, and runway incursions can be a considerable risk in the NAS. So I want to head this over to Scott. Scott, would you mind discussing the definition of a runway incursion and what we see?
Sure. Thanks, Bridget. Thanks, Matt. Next slide, please. Good afternoon. Welcome back. So a runway incursion is any incorrect presence of an aircraft, vehicle, or person in the protected area of a surface designated for the landing and takeoff of aircraft. So the one thing I want to highlight from this picture is the yellow line. Within the Runway Safety Office, as Bridget said, the reports that we get from the field facilities, the commonality when an aircraft commits a runway incursion is they've crossed the yellow line without a clearance. One thing I want to stress here is when a pilot is told to hold short of a runway, that includes this yellow line. The hold short clearance is short of the yellow line. It's not the white line on the runway. We see a lot of times where a pilot will be told to hold short of runway 36 and they cross the yellow line, but they stop short of the white line. That's incorrect. So I want to make sure that's the key takeaway from this slide. Remain short of the yellow line when told to hold short. Next slide. So again, approaching the hold short line, you're going to meet the double solid lines first. You need the authorization from a controller to enter or cross the protected area. The yellow lines define the protected area. Crossing this line without authorization is the most common type of runway incursion. Next slide. So again, when clearing the runway, you're going to hit the double dash lines first. You are expected to go past this line if nothing is impeding forward movement. If a controller says turn left to taxiway Romeo and contact ground, you are expected to turn left to taxiway Romeo, taxi fully across the yellow line. Your entire aircraft needs to be across the yellow line and contact ground. And that is an indication that you're clear of the runway. If the controller tells you to hold short of a point in front of you and you cannot physically clear the runway, that is the responsibility of the controller to protect the runway behind you. You don't have to worry about clearing the hold bar if you've been told to hold short of a point. The key here is nothing is impeding your forward movement. If nothing is impeding, you need to keep moving across that hold line to be clear of the runway. Bridget, back to you.
Thanks, Scott. Now let's go ahead and go to the next slide real quick. All right, so we're looking at classifications of runway incursions. So runway incursions are classified into various different types. And really what it boils down to is who is it attributed to? So an operational incidents, they're attributed to air traffic controllers, whether it's their action or their inaction. We also have pilot deviations and vehicle pedestrian deviations. Pilot deviations are attributed to the pilots operating an aircraft under its own power. And then you also have the vehicle or pedestrian one where it's attributed to a vehicle driver or a non-pilot operating an aircraft under its power. I think of a maintenance guy going out with the tug, right? That's a good example of a VPD. Let's go on to the next slide. All right, so when we're looking at this, I love this graph because there's actually a lot that boils down into this. Earlier, I mentioned the 1,713 runway incursions that took place this past fiscal year. And I said that about half of them were non-conflict events. Well, if you're looking at this graph here, what I'm talking about is category D. So category D runway incursions have no other aircraft or vehicle involved. As you can see, the aircraft just crossed the hold short lines, which Scott was talking about previously, but there's nobody else out there. When we're looking at this, so all of these severities can be really assigned based on three components. Okay, the three components being proximity, speed, and closure rates of the events. So proximity, how close are they getting? And you can see in the graph as they go from C to A, C, B, and A is we barely avoided a collision. B, we've got significant potential for a collision, but it's a little bit further back, right? And then C, there's ample time and distance to avoid that collision. So again, I think this is a great depiction of what a category A, B, C, and D runway incursion severity looks like. And Matt, did you want to add anything here?
Thanks, Bridget. I would add that this is not an automatic process, and there is equal representation from all the different entities that are involved. So this could be not just a pilot deviation, but you could think of this like a vehicle or a tug with an aircraft in tow. And these are actually reviewed by folks here in the FAA, and they look at not just the data, but they look at the whole event itself to classify those. And one of our regional administrators, whenever we talk about categories, he brings up the fact that these are all runway incursions, right? So we do tend to focus on the A's or the A and B's, but I think looking at the entire picture and looking at all categories together is also helpful.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, I mean, that's a valid point. So we have, the group is called, what you were talking about, Matt, the group was called the RIAT, so the Runway Incursion Analysis Team. So there's different stakeholders on that team that literally looks at every single one of those incidents. So of the 1,713 runway incursions that took place, this team analyzes each one of these events and says, okay, we've got operational incident, again, attributed to the air traffic controller, pilot deviation attributed to the pilot, and VPD attributed to the vehicle driver, or again, being, if it's an aircraft, it would be, like I mentioned before, a maintenance vehicle. So those folks come together, they actually come together weekly to look at each one of those type, or basically each of these events that get processed. All that being said, there are a lot of barriers that are in place. So you will note, or I'd like to note, that while we may have a category D with little or no risk of collision, when we get towards the category B, C, and A, a lot of the barriers that are in place in the NAS broke down at some point in time. So whether it was something that was missed by the pilot or the controller or a vehicle operator, there were some type of barrier that unfortunately broke down. So Scott, would you mind looking at the numbers a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. Before we move on, though, I'd like to answer two questions that I see in the Q&A section. Somebody asked, is breaching the ILS mark also considered a serious RI? We don't rate that type of incursion, but it is a runway incursion because you've incurred on the protected surface. So yes, it is serious, but it's not a rateable event because you've actually, you're only crossing the ILS hold line and not a runway hold short line. And then the next question is, a category A also includes actual collisions. We rate collisions in a separate category. A category A is you barely avoided the collision. So an accident is over and above a category A. I just wanted to make that two there. And then we can move on to the next slide, please. So again, same fiscal year time as wrong surface data. We have fiscal year 17 to end of fiscal year 22. Total runway incursions in the FAA system. We have 8,132. Bridget talked about the different categories. So you can see 4,846 were your least severe category D events. And then as you move up to the most severe, the numbers start getting lower. 3,175 for C, 48 for B, and 26 for A. There's another category that you might have saw on a previous slide as a category E. If we don't have enough data to rate an event, let's say we're looking for a pilot statement or some radar data that we need to review, we rate that as a category E, and it doesn't fall into one of these categories. Next slide. So then we break that down a little further. How many of these runway incursions were attributed to pilot action now? So for just pilot deviation runway incursions, we have 5,204. Again, over half category D, and then category C, B, and A. Category A is still up to 7 for the fiscal year. It doesn't sound like a lot in the 5-year time span, but that's the most severe category where 2 airplanes barely missed touching. So that's a lot. Next slide. Then you get into the general aviation, pilot deviation, runway incursions. And the thing I want to focus on here is that 7 number that I just talked about. In this slide, category A is 6. So we're seeing our general aviation aircraft incur at the most severe occasions, category A. Again, 2,786 category D, again, over half of the runway incursions attributed to GA pilots. Matt Porter, do you want to add anything to these slides?
Yeah, I would add that, you know, from a pilot's perspective, kind of what I hinted at earlier, regardless of the category, there was, you know, some sort of breakdown to cause that pilot deviation. So, you know, I just want to point out the totals that Scott went over. So of the total runway incursions, we had 8,000. over 5,000 of those were pilot deviations. And then out of that 5,000, we have 4,000 that were attributed to general aviation pilot deviations. So, you know, that would lead us to roughly 4 out of 5 runway incursions attributed to pilot actions that are also GA pilot deviations. You know, but what I want to add to that, I guess, is the focus today is not necessarily on only those general aviation pilot deviations. If you're a flight instructor, if you are attending and you represent a pilot school, you're in a unique position to influence our future pilot population. So, you know, we want to focus on effective surface safety education and flight training for the entire pilot population, whether that be GA pilots or future air carrier pilots. So in addition to the, you know, many short-term or immediate solutions that we've talked about today, I also want to focus or just kind of point out that the focus of today is that long-term solution.
All right, thank you, Matt. Bridget, I'll turn it back to you. We move on to the next slide.
All right. So historical data. I like this slide because it can really give just an overall high level picture of what are we looking at and with regards to numbers. So over the last 5 years, about 64% of the runway incursions were attributed to pilot deviations, roughly 19% vehicle pedestrian deviations or VPDs, and then 17% were attributed to air traffic controllers, or otherwise known as operational incidents. Of all of those events, general aviation aircraft were involved in 78% of these events. So that's a fairly high number. You guys are our next airline pilots, our next cargo pilots, right? You're training those individuals, or you yourself will be one of those. Keep this kind of information as mind when you're training other folks as well. Matt, would you like to add anything?
No, I think that's a good summary of kind of what we talked about. Thanks, Bridget.
And let's go on to the next slide and talk about basically the highest ranking causal factors of runway incursions. So air traffic control. So I'm going to look at the OI, the VPD, and the PD. So OI, operational incident. Air traffic control cleared an aircraft to land or depart on an occupied runway. So in other words, a lot of these would be optimistic expectations. So say the aircraft on final doesn't slow as expected, and we have an aircraft that we've cleared for departure. Maybe that aircraft doesn't begin their departure roll as quickly as anticipated. So we have a thing called anticipated separation. Either way, it results in a loss of standard separation. I'll give a quick example. So say and I'm purely talking about, I'll just say jets. So if you do not have 6,000 feet and airborne, if it's 5,599 feet, then you had a loss of standard separation, because with regards to a departure, subsequent departures, or an arrival and a departure with 2 jets, for us within the 7110.65, we need 6,000 feet and airborne. Pilot. So the PD. Pilot failed to hold short of a runway as instructed. The vast majority of these, the readbacks are correct. Okay, we just happen to not hold short of those yellow lines that Scott was showing in the beginning. With regards to this, I do believe we brought it up vaguely, but I'm going to go into a little bit more depth. This was brought to my attention last week in a conversation. If we say proceed up, if a controller says proceed up to hold short of runway 17, what that means is proceed up to and hold short of that hold short line. Do not cross that hold short line. That does not mean the white line. That doesn't mean the edge line of the runway. Do not cross those yellow hold short lines without authorization. With regards to pilot, the VPD, or vehicle pedestrian deviation, the vast majority are the driver entered a runway without authorization, or they failed to hold short of the runway. Matt, can I hand this off to you if you have anything to elaborate?
Absolutely, yes, thank you. So the I guess my focus in flight standards and as a flight instructor myself would be, why does the pilot fail to hold short of the runways instructed? One of the attendees brought this up earlier about uncontrolled airports. So one of our focus in, a lot of the data that we have reviewed today is from air traffic control, and it's, it seems to be focused on controlled airports. But over half of the operations occur at uncontrolled airports, and runway incursions can also happen there. But the why, I think, is important. So if you're a student or you're an instructor and you primarily train from an uncontrolled airport, you'll be very used to those procedures. And not all of us that started out training at those airports are comfortable going to those controlled airports, because either the opportunities don't exist, or maybe our lesson plans don't have us going to those. I would just encourage you, and encourage, I guess, us as an industry to focus on how can we be comfortable at both. So what is it, think about what does it take to procedurally to operate at an uncontrolled airport, and then think about that compared to operations at a controlled airport. Become familiar with those, take your students to those airports, and plan out flights where you will, where the opportunity exists to operate in both controlled and uncontrolled. And it also goes the other way around. There's a lot of flight schools that operate at controlled airports, and even some of the bigger controlled airports. So don't forget to take your students out to those uncontrolled airports. Make sure they're comfortable and familiar with those operations.
Thanks, Matt. Let's go to our next slide. I really want to take the opportunity to focus on the importance of readbacks. I know in our next panel, we're going to talk a lot about phraseology, and I'm sure this will come up there. But a full readback allows the controller to ensure that the pilot received the clearance as intended. So sometimes this is the only opportunity to catch and correct a mistake or misunderstanding. So allow that back and forth to make sure that we can be on the same page. So a readback is much like a contract. This is a good analogy. Somebody gave me a long time ago. But as a controller, I give an instruction. You guys, the pilot would receive the instruction and then repeat that instruction. And then I have the due diligence of making sure that that readback was correct. So in other words, you have that pilot communication loop. If we don't complete that loop, if we don't sign that contract together, then we don't have a contract. So I hope that's a different way. I hope you guys see a different way of me explaining that. But don't forget that full readbacks are required for all hold short instructions. That's what I mean by that contract. If you don't read back your call sign with that full runway assignment, then I don't have that contract signed. And they're going to hear a controller ask you, hey, can you read back the runway assignment? And then we'll say, I told you hold short to runway 17 left, and you only said 17. You didn't see the left. Okay, well, I need it. Or you didn't utilize your call sign. You'll hear the controller again ask, because I need to make sure that that contract is signed. And ultimately, if you missed something with that full readback and you accidentally crossed that hold short line, it wouldn't be a pilot deviation. It would actually be an operational incident, because that responsibility of making sure that readback was correct was on me if you repeated it incorrectly. So during the landing clearance, I want to make sure I bring this up. Please repeat the runway. Don't just say clear to land. You'd be surprised at how many times I get clear to land, just a response of clear to land. I work at an airport with 7 runways, whether there's 2 runways or 7 runways. We should not be in the business of making assumptions. We need to be professional on the line. So missing or incomplete readbacks lead to questions and also sometimes mistakes. Safety works when we work together. And Scott or Matt, did you have anything to follow up with this?
I just wanted to say one last thing. Controllers are required to give specific runway crossings. If you do not hear a specific runway crossing for your aircraft, do not cross the yellow line. That's all I'd like to leave you with.
Thanks. I know we're about out of time, but I did have a couple things I wanted to go over to leave you with. I hope your takeaway from today, not just from this presentation, would be that we are all in this together for safety, whether you're a controller, a student pilot, or even a rusty pilot. So I look forward to continuing this conversation, this important safety topic. If you want to get involved, I have to take the opportunity to say you can get involved by contacting your FAA safety team program manager, and you can find that on the FAAsafety.gov. Thank you.
Well, excellent. Bridget, Scott, Matt, thank you very much for that informative presentation. And we're going to go ahead and move on to our second panel. In that panel, what we're going to do is discuss the importance of using correct phraseology and what can happen when instructions are not clearly communicated. Have you ever heard someone answer a yes or no question by saying Roger? And I ask that rhetorically because everybody, whether you're an attendee or a panelist, has heard that many times, and no matter what environment you're operating in. We've all heard it. And what Roger means is I have received all of your last transmission. It should not be used to answer a question requiring a yes or no answer. So acknowledgement does not mean affirmative or negative. It simply means I heard. Using correct phraseology is key to getting our message across in a way that is understood by air traffic control and other pilots. With that, let me introduce our panelists for panel 2. With us today, we have Jillian Moore, who is a pilot and content creator. Jillian, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much.
Next, we have John Murdoch, who's a NATCA National Procedures Representative. John, thanks for being here.
Hey, Jamal, good morning or afternoon now.
Yes.
Thanks.
We're moving along. We're moving along. Next, we have Brad Ziegler, who's an aviation safety inspector with an Airman Training and Certification Group. Brad, welcome.
Good afternoon, Jamal. Thank you for having me.
And lastly, we have Mary Hart, who was with our FAA ATO Technical Operations Organization. Mary, glad you're here.
Thank you, and appreciate being able to be a part of all of this.
So what we want to do now is we want to start with some questions. And John, I'm going to start with you because you are a procedural specialist. I'd be very interested in any words of wisdom that you would have for the attendees today regarding this particular topic.
Yeah, sure, Jamal. I appreciate the shout out there, specialist, or, you know, I don't know if I'm special, but I don't know if I'm a specialist sometimes, right? But yeah, I would say so. We see a few things, right, in the office and the folks that I work with often. And well, let me start here. We have a saying: say what you mean and mean what you say, right? And there's some times where we want to hear some specific words as air traffic from the pilots, and there's times that you as a pilot have to provide us some specific words. Like when we issue a hold short clearance, I need you to say you're going to hold short of that runway, whatever that is. If you don't say it, we're probably going to ask you to say it. There's even times when, like even a visual separation stuff, we'll ask that you're going to, hey, you have to say these words to us. So what's important really is if you talk back to us and say it like we said it, right? Bridget said it in the earlier panel about, hey, give us a read back, and you kind of put then the responsibility on us to make sure that you have the information correctly and said it correctly. So if you say it back to us like we said it to you, everybody will be on the same page. We all used in the same words, and then everybody should end up in right where they need to be, and we don't have any problems that we have to deal with.
I like that. Jillian, did you want to add anything to that from the pilot's perspective?
Yeah, no, I think all of that is definitely right on. And from the pilot perspective as well, just of making sure and trusting that ATC will ask you to say something. Although I will add that even though a readback is definitely an indication that that transmission has been received, there's always, the next step of, was that really understood and processed by the pilot? Because, I've definitely had some moments where even if I've said something right back, maybe I didn't fully understand what I said, a minute later I go, wait, which runway did they say, or what taxiway was I supposed to hold short of? So definitely from the pilot side, just making sure that we take a second to really not only read back, but also understand.
No, and you bring up a good point. Even if your memory is good enough to regurgitate what you've heard, a taxi 22 or taxi 22 would be Alpha Romeo Whiskey Victor, and you get all that back, and then you look at your airfield director, you look at your map, and you just have no idea what you're going to do with that information, right? You were able to regurgitate it, but being able to actually apply what you heard and read back is equally as important to getting the read back correct. So you bring up a great point. Mary, I want to transition to you to hear from the other side of the perspective, because you've driven on the surface for many years in order to accomplish your work. What example or examples can you give us of phraseology that drivers may misunderstand and lead to a runway incursion? Mary, you're talking. You may want to unmute yourself.
Yep.
There
okay.
We go. Gotcha.
Had to be the tech ops guy that makes the mistake, right? Sure. And again, thanks for letting me be a part of this. There's been times when a request for crossing a runway might not be referenced by the active traffic flow. For example, I may sound like this: FAA Tech Ops 10 at West Cargo, requesting to cross 7 left at Echo 3 to Foxtrot, heading to the glide slope shelter. Then air traffic responds: FAA Tech Ops 10, proceed and hold short of 25 right. Despite a correct readback on my part, the reality is the operational flow, they're using the 25s. And if I'm not focused and clarify, I might cross 7 left thinking they were referencing the parallel runway 7 right, and I've created that runway incursion because I didn't take the time to listen to the ATIS and make sure I knew the flow.
No, that's a great point. It's always a little bit weird, from the pilot's perspective, we're talking about, or we think we're talking about just other airplanes moving around, but at more robust locations, you have to remain vigilant to the fact that there's a lot of other things that are happening besides just airplanes moving around, and you have to be cognizant of that and remain vigilant in those environments. So thank you for that. Brad, I want to transition to you. And as a safety inspector, is there phraseology that's typically misunderstood from student pilots?
There is, and actually, I just want to point out, it's not just student pilots. Certificated pilots have as much of a challenge as student pilots. One of the things that we focus on is we're pilots. We fly airplanes. We fly through the sky. Taxiing on an airport is not why we're flying airplanes around. So sometimes we tend to focus less on that aspect and more on the aviation and the aeronautical side of things. So, one of the challenges of phraseology is particularly in terms of taxi instruction, specifically crossing runways. And I just want to throw out a little statistic here, and that what I find interesting. And I started flying about 30 years ago, and at that time, there was no such thing as turn-by-turn instructions, GPS navigators in cars, that sort of thing. So, if you learn to drive, you learn how to read a map. Most pilots who are learning to fly under age 30 have never driven a car without a TomTom or some sort of turn-by-turn instructions. So when they get into the cockpit and get to a towered airport, they're not only having to mentally prepare for the flight, but they're also having to mentally transcribe controller instructions into actions that they have to cue themselves to do. I haven't come across a navigator, and I'm sure someone will correct me with that something out there that'll actually cue for turns on the airport surface. But to a certain degree, most of the equipment we're using, whether it's a electronic flight bag or paper charts or whatever, we're having to mentally translate instructions from the controller into actions that we take to get to the departure end of the runway. And in regards to crossing runways, I want to point something out. Actually, this problem, I can trace it back to about 80 years ago. And I say that most of the airport development in the United States took place during World War II and the years leading up to that. And back in those days, we didn't have a lot of time to figure out what the prevailing wind directions were, and we were flying airplanes with tail wheels. So crosswinds were an issue. So, we built a whole bunch of airports shaped in a triangle, and that was great for training and Navy and Army Air Corps trainers. But in the modern world, as many of those original footprints still exist today to a certain degree, it's created a geometry challenge for pilots, because what happens is we've now added taxiways parallel to all of those strange triangles out there. So now we have all sorts of weird runway crossings, here and there. So one of the challenges I find is, you get your taxiway instructions. When it comes to runways and crossing runways, you're going to get some every taxiway clearance that you get is that requires you to cross a runway is going to include instructions to either hold short or to cross an intersection runway. So if you get your taxiway clearance and it doesn't include a taxiway or a runway crossing instruction, either to cross it or to hold short, you need to clarify that. And sort of the way I treat runways when I'm taxiing on the surface of an airport is I treat runways like you treat a railroad crossing in a car. So the old stop, look, listen sort of applies. And when I say stop, look, listen, stop, I'm not saying physically stop on the taxiway, just like roads have crossing lights in rails for railroad crossings. We have air traffic control that gives us a clearance to cross the runway or not cross the runway. But what I do say is stop looking inside the cockpit and move your eyes outside the cockpit at that point. Slow down and take a look and visually verify that there's no aircraft or vehicles or anything on this runway that you're about to cross. So stop, look, and of course listen, and that means listen for the air traffic, listen to the controller. You're probably still on ground control unless you've been specifically instructed to switch over the tower. And for any further instructions, you may receive an amended taxi clearance, in which case you need to act accordingly. But it's important to mention that ATC will generally clear you to cross one runway at a time. But there are exceptions. Runways are in close proximity to each other. It's not practical for ATC to issue another crossing instruction. So you may get a clearance to cross more than once. But the important thing is when you get your taxiway clearance, write it down and repeat back, but don't try to translate that clearance into instructions just yet. When you call up and get your clearance, write it down, read it back, but then after you've read it back, that's the time that you should either mentally or physically, in some cases with electronic flight bags, you can trace that route on your airport diagram and figure out where you're going and then ask for questions. But, I know many of you listening on here today have, come across that grumpy controller that you're just scared to death to ask a question because what's he or she going to say if I ask, but clarify, because safety is a shared thing, and you're never wrong for getting clarification of instructions, particularly when you're crossing runways.
And I like that you said that, because we've had Bridget and Trevor on earlier talking about the benefits of over communicating and making it a point to talk to them, to ask clarifying questions, because that is what ATC is there to do, is to help. So I like that you said that, Brad. In the vein of airport complexity as it relates to, communication, Bridget, Jillian, I want to transition to you. In your experience, have you experienced a time where you had to ask for that clarification based on, what you heard or something that was communicated to you?
Yes, absolutely. There have been several instances of that, but the one that comes to mind first. So during my instrument training over this past summer, I was flying into a lot of airports that were a lot bigger than I had been used to for private. So not only did that mean that the airport layouts and taxi instructions were often much more complex, but there were also a lot of other aircraft, in the vicinity and on the ground to be aware of. So when I was getting my taxi instructions and IFR clearance on the ground in Teterboro, New Jersey, I was already a little bit overwhelmed. That's a crazy busy airport. But then as soon as I was ready to taxi out, ATC changed up my taxi instructions and told me to follow a jet that was taxiing out ahead of us. But of course, being one of, if not the busiest private jet airports in the country, there were a ton of jets taxiing around everywhere. And at that point in time, didn't know my citations from my phenoms, from my globals. So I had no idea where they wanted me and who they wanted me to wait for. So in that situation, you kind of have two options. You wing it, no pun intended, or you sit, wait, and ask for clarification. So rather than moving my little Cessna 172 into a place where I wasn't sure it was supposed to be, I instead contacted the controller and asked for a clearer instruction as to where I should go. And that, made it a lot safer, I wasn't losing anything by waiting and asking a follow-up question on that. But I would also say on that too, just because an airport is simpler or smaller or less busy doesn't mean that it's immune to being, confusing. So even just a couple of days ago, I was doing pattern work at a small Class Delta airport in Virginia. And when I was ready to clear the runway and go back to the flight school, I was told to hold short on taxiway alpha for a regional jet that was departing ahead of me. And, I read that back and then again had one of those moments of, wait, did they say to hold short of taxiway alpha or on taxiway alpha? And so then again, I had no idea where they wanted me to wait. I'd never actually been told to have, do that instruction before. So I didn't know what I was supposed to do in that case. So again, in that instance, if you don't know, just asked and ended up being totally fine. But I do think it's important to remember again that even though it was an airport with one runway and basically one long taxiway, still could be confusing sometimes.
No, completely agree. And that one little point of clarification could make all the difference, and especially in an environment like that where there's not a lot of wiggle room to enact corrective actions in terms of doing workaround or trying to, taxi around something else. So all that stuff factors in, and it's good that you're able to do that. I want to ask John if he has anything to follow up, just from the controller's perspective, where if you have an experience where there just wasn't that clarity in message on the other side, and you had to kind of work that out to kind of get the message right between pilot and controller.
Thanks, Jamal. I think it actually happens more than most believe. And pilots have questions, and every one of our words tend to matter, right? And we're really specific, even that on or at, right? In Jillian's example is really important to me and you at the end of the day as the pilot. So it's always really, really good if you have a question, ask, right? Because in our industry, in a safety culture, it's really, really important that we're all on the same page and we're all marching to the same beat of the as we go along there. So if there is a question, just ask, and we'll definitely clarify for it. And even if you can't do it in like a phraseology sense or really clear, we can just use plain language, right? We'll just talk through it. And I'll always encourage you, especially on the surface, if you're not sure, just stop, right? Even our airline partners are really good they're like, hey, we got to stop for a minute here. We're going to do something and set the parking brake. As long as you're not on that runway, it's okay to stop and give us a call, and we'll help get you to where you need to be or clarify whatever question you have. There's no rush, right? Let's just let's do it and do it safely.
No, that's a good point, John. I'm glad you made it. I want to open this next question up to the entire panel just to get everybody's insight. And essentially, what is one key takeaway from this panel that you'd want to make sure that is communicated to all of our attendees today? And we'll start with Mary, and then we'll go Mary, Jillian, John, and Brad.
right. Well, I would say preparation is probably the biggest takeaway, that situational awareness. And for us drivers of vehicles, we're typically the smallest item out there moving about, keeping a minimal footprint. So ensuring we know the flow and we communicate using that same flow terminology, but also before we roll into the airfields, know what construction or closures may be going on, and then preparing for that, making sure alternate paths. And if it's really busy or dark, we have a lot of equipment scattered around the airfield, so we need to be prepared and we need to have an extra set of eyes. So bring a buddy along with us to help keep a visual on what's going on around us as we're trying to get to our locations.
Great point, Mary Jillian.
Yeah, a very similar point to Mary's in the same vein of that situational awareness. But one of the best lessons that I've learned about surface safety and frankly just aviation is to always be aware of not only what the tower is telling you and communicating to you, but also what is being communicated to the other planes around you. In a perfect world, nothing is ever ambiguous. Every pilot follows every instruction to a T, but of course, mistakes can and do happen. So being aware not only of what's happening inside of your aircraft, but where other airplanes are being told to go, and maybe if they're deviating what they're doing, is always going to help you.
No, that's great advice, Jillian. John, Brad?
Yeah, Jamal, yeah, you said one thing. I got one handful of things, but I'm going to try to stick to one. So I'll say, I think from a controller's perspective, the one of the biggest things we want to know is if you're unsure, right? If you're not 100% sure what we need you to do or asked you to do, ask the question back to us, right? We want to make sure it's clear because you're the number one stakeholder here, right? We're providing a service for you, and if you're unsure and something doesn't go right, you could end up in a bad spot. So at the end of the day, I think is if there's a question or if you're unsure, ask it back to us and we'll make sure we're on the same page and we're headed the right direction.
And Brad, go ahead.
It's interesting. Clarity is truly a key of the controller and pilot relationship. One of my other interests is railroading, and I was doing some research one day, and I was learning about track authorities. As someone who is a ATP and has gotten plenty of taxi clearances and IFR clearances, it's interesting how the railroads handle their dispatching and how they handle track authority. And one of the things I thought was interesting was they not only read back once, but they read back twice, and they spell out their readbacks. So if you're on track 2 east, it's track 2 TWO east EASC. I mean, they, and obviously they're a little different. There's only one rail that you can't change at the last minute when you see another train coming. So, but it's interesting in that, sometimes you have to adapt to the operation. And so, if something's not clear and if you're not sure what the controller said, make sure that you make it clear. And I've heard many clips, particularly with pilots who English is not their first language, really struggling to understand a controller's instructions. Sometimes it may come down to where you literally have to spell out the word that you're trying to say. Now, I'm not saying that pilot has a good enough grasp of the English language to operate an aircraft, but at the end of the day, we're all trying to, fly safely and get our operations. So, whatever it takes to make sure that the pilot or the instructor or the controller understands what you're telling them, or you understand what they're telling you, is really key.
And Brad, I'm glad that you said that, because that was almost a perfect segue into the next question that I want to ask the panel, because we talk about standard phraseology, and I wanted to ask why it's important to stick to that. And like I said, your statement brought up a good point, because, in the instance of the operator whose English wasn't the second language, that standard phraseology may go a long way and helping them to understand certain things. Whereas if you're using, colloquial language and it deviates from what they were expecting to hear as standard phraseology, it could really mess things up. So I wanted to pose that to the group about standard phraseology and the importance of sticking to standard phraseology. I'll start with Jillian, and then we'll go Jillian, Brad, John, and Mary.
Yeah, someone that went through flight training relatively recently, one of the very, very first things that we learn as pilots in training is the principle of aviate, navigate, and communicate. So those are the three important things that you do in an emergency. So communicate is that last one. So that is one of like the three most integral aspects to, the safe operation of a flight. I think of standard phraseology really is just a tool that we have as pilots and controllers to streamline communications, mitigate any ambiguity, and overall just make it so that, communication, there's no room, or there's, less room for interpretation where something could be misunderstood. So I really think of it as a tool more than anything else.
Brad, I was silent because I saw your mic go off.
Yeah, when I first started flying up in the DC area, it's interesting because, local terms and names can be helpful, but locals is a relative term. I was based in an airport that was 1.1 nautical miles away from another airport, and I recall the folks at the other airport would always make reference to crossing a marina inbound to their airport. And of course, I had no idea what marina they were talking about because no one at my airport ever made reference to this marina. And, we were basically, we could high five each other from from our two airports. So, if you're going to use landmarks, that's great, but make sure you follow it up with a specific physical location. And the video that we showed earlier in the day was a great example of, if you're on an IFR approach and you make reference to a fix inbound, that's great for everyone else who's not just instrument rated, but also familiar with the instrument approaches at that airport. But it doesn't help the student pilot who's on their first solo cross country. This is their first time in the airport and they have no idea where the pub's intersection is. So, if you're going to do that, let people know what that is. It adds a couple seconds on the radio, but it makes a huge difference for everyone listening in.
Potomac and Hyde Field by chance?
You got it.
I know exactly. As soon as you said marina, I knew exactly what you were talking about.
Well, now I'm based at Potomac, so I know definitely where the marina that is, but it's definitely important though to be able to make it clear where the landmarks are and where the aircraft is. So.
Yeah, understood. We'll go John and then Mary.
I think Brad brings up a couple good points that touch on that are outside prescribed phraseology, but it's really important if you're not from the area or you're a student low time pilot. I don't know the difference, right? Everybody's a pilot. So tell us, right? Student pilot, low time pilot, or somebody not from the area that needs some assistance or they're not familiar with it. Well, we're going to go that extra mile for you. So just let us know, right? Jump on, say, hey, student pilot, or say it's my first time, or I'm not really familiar with the airport, or even, hey, I was just dealing with something and I landed and I thought I was ready to taxi, but I'm not. Can you help give me some progressive taxi instructions or something like that? So not a problem. Happy to do that service for anybody that needs it. But like prescribed phraseology is like a kind of a unique beast, right? We have a book and a handbook that controllers use to issue clearances, but there's really nothing in the AIM that says how a pilot has to talk back to me, right? Those words aren't necessarily clearly defined. And that's why I usually just generally say it like we said it, and we'll generally be on the same page, right? And so if the words are similar and or if they're the same, even better, that I think generally is the best way to talk back and forth between the controller and the pilot.
Excellent. And then Mary, we'll wrap this question with you.
Sure. To me, it's simple that if you build a structure and you stick with that structure, then it becomes a habit. That muscle memory comes into play. So I always communicate back the same way to the controllers that I'm communicating with, no matter what airport I might be driving on.
Right. And I mentioned before when the symposium first kicked off about our From the Flight Deck video series, there really is a wealth of information, not only in the air, but on the ground. As we're talking about some of these things that provide, those videos provide that information that can really help you just become a more competent operator in some of these operations that we're talking about. So just another plug for those videos and what they can give you, from a resource standpoint. So Mary, you as the last responder, I want to go back to you because in your experience as a technician, I think some of the things that you can offer to some of our attendees even go beyond just being a technician. If you're a guy who works on an FBO and has to get around the airport in the truck, you're conducting work there, mowing grass, things of that nature. What are there tools that you're aware of that can help these folks to prepare for being on an airfield?
Sure. And recently, I saw a new demonstration on the new construction notices that are tied to the NOTAM tools. So you can pull those up and see what construction is going on in part of your preparation. These are very helpful, especially if you're at one of the larger airfields that has multiple runways and lots of taxiways tangled up with each other. Something else that is ongoing right now is a new initiative. I'm working with the 3 service areas on the technical operations side of the house to develop KMZ files that overlay on Google Earth that will include the runway safety areas and the ILS critical areas, because beyond the paved, improved part of the airfield, there's a lot of unimproved areas that we have to go. We might encroach on those areas and not necessarily know it. So those folks that are out doing mowing and trimming or working on the lighting that's along the edges of the runways, that's very important for us to know where that's at, how those cables are run. So you can take those maps, overlay them, print them off and have them with you, and do some analysis before you ever get out on the airfield of where those cable runs are at and the handholds and where those fixtures might be on the airfield.
Those are all great points. I think, like I said, when you're operating on the other side, it can be a little daunting.
Yes.
And it's good to know that those resources are available to kind of help you be a little bit more comfortable to accomplish, your job, whether you're in the truck or a lawnmower or whatever thing without wings you're operating on the airfield. We have a question, and John, you as the controller, I want to ask this of you that we just received. And the question says, I recently received a landing clearance from ATC, and the airplane ahead of me and on the runway decided to take its time clearing the runway. I understand that this is an operational incident, but as a pilot, should I go around or continue if it's safe to land since the other airplane is way down on the other end of the runway? Would you like to answer that?
Yeah, I'll take a shot at it. So it's might not be quite enough information for this specific instance, but here's what I would say. So as the pilot, you're responsible for safely operating aircraft, right? If there's a question if you should land, if there's an aircraft or even a vehicle, maybe a person, because that's happened too on that runway, you should ask, right? If you have time to ask. But if you're low and close in and you think the safest course of action is not to land on that surface because something doesn't seem right, maybe execute a go around or a missed approach, depending on what's ever appropriate in that case, contact air traffic for instructions. So it's a little bit of a non-answer answer because it's very specific instances. I can't really provide a great answer to them, but I would probably say, yeah, if there's a question you're not sure, ask if you have time to ask. If you don't have the time to ask, do what's in the safe interest of the flight and either maybe execute a go around or missed approach, whichever appropriate.
No, that's a fair point. Brad, I want to hear your response as an inspector, if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, as pilot in command, you're responsible for the safety of that operation. So if you see a situation that in your presumption may become a unsafe situation, it's your authority and obligation to take the actions necessary to avoid it. So, if there's a situation where you think you need to go around and try again, of course, do that. That's the important thing. And one of the things that I think a lot of pilots, when they get into controlled airspace, and you see this a lot, particularly in controlled D airspace, where it's some of the less busy but towered fields. There's a certain expectation that the controller is there to basically tell you what to do. And the important thing is to understand that as a pilot, you still have the authority for the safety of that aircraft. And there are going to be situations where, an instruction does not necessarily mean the same thing as separation. Separation is a very specific definition. And I know our friends in the air traffic world can discuss what their requirements are. But as pilots, we live in a real world where we have to, make assessments based on the operation of the aircraft, what our performance variables are, the weather conditions, and what might be acceptable one day might not be acceptable another day. So, taking in consideration the condition of the runway and the winds and that sort of thing, to a controller, they've done the squeeze play 1,000 times, and they know they can get you in. You're a student pilot, you might not feel as comfortable. If it doesn't look safe, exercise your PIC authority, do a go around and try again, and work with the controllers for a situation that you're okay with. And if the situation doesn't work out, try again. There's always another turn in the pattern. There's always plenty of other airports if that doesn't work either. So do what's right for you.
Right. No, great points, Brad, and I appreciate you elaborating on that. The next question I want to ask is for Jillian and Brad as pilots, and then Mary as an operator on the ground. Have you ever used unable as a response to a clearance, and why? So I'll start with Jillian and then go to Brad to hear the pilot's perspective on if you ever used unable, and then Mary on the technician side. And then after that, I want to go to John and see what happens on the controller side when somebody says unable. So have you ever used unable as a response to a clearance? We'll go Jillian, Brad, and then Mary.
Yes, absolutely. So I've used unable a good few times, and the situation that comes to mind first is, when I'm landing and I'm still going pretty fast down the runway there, and they say, turn left on taxiway Charlie and, head over. And I'm still going, 35 miles an hour, and that's not really going to be an option. So instead of absolutely killing the brakes and, putting yourself and your aircraft in a position of danger, you just say unable and keep going. As a barely licensed pilot, also, I remember using unable as a response to a land and hold short clearance. So, when they're intersecting runways, tower can tell you, land on this runway and then hold short of this one. So at the time, of course, there's plenty of runway. It was a beautiful day. Every, I guess, piece of data for that day, I should have been fine landing and holding short. And that's probably true. But, as a very new and relatively inexperienced pilot, making that call, to say unable, and, being a little worried initially that tower is, going to judge me or whatever. But, at the end of the day, if I'm unable to do something, I'm unable to do it. And I feel really good about that call.
No, fair enough. I've seen in both the ground and the air, I've seen an albatross, which is a jet, have to say unable due to performance criteria. They were asked to do a certain thing on a IFR climb out. They just couldn't do it. And so there's no pride there. You just say unable because he knew the performance characteristics of the aircraft at that time. And then ATC came back and accommodated him. So I completely agree with you. It just is what it is. And you have to call it out so that the correction can be applied. Brad, on your side, what do you say?
Yeah, as a GA pilot, I'm used to flying slow aircraft, planes that, I get bug splatters on the trailing edge of my surfaces. And, one of the things is, particularly at larger airports, I want to try to fit in as best I can, knowing that, I'm slow and I'm kind of in the way, when I'm at White Plains in my Cessna 182 and everyone else is in their kerosene burners, I know that the controllers want to kind of get me moving as quick as possible. But, I don't know if I actually use the words unable, but I know I've been offered intersection departures before. And I look at it this way, if the full runway is there and it's in service, why not take it? So I know I've been offered, intersection takeoffs, which, offered, plenty of runway surface, but, my opinion is runway behind you, of course, is of no use to you. So, that's one of those situations where perhaps it doesn't help the efficiency as much, but it's always your right to use the full length of the runway. And generally, I think our friends in ATC are offering that to do us a favor, to kind of not hold us up. And I appreciate that, but when possible, I try to use the full length of the runway, and that's just one sort of example. But I'm sure there are others. I just can't remember off the top of my head. But as PIC, we always have the right to say unable, and then be prepared to negotiate something that works for both sides.
Right, like you said before, you're ultimately responsible for your aircraft as PIC, right? So you do everything to maintain that responsibility. So I completely agree with you. Mary, I'm very curious to hear on your side if you've had to use unable in your operations as a technician on the ground.
Actually, I have, not when I was operating as a single vehicle, but when I was escorting construction vehicles across, and we needed to cross the runway. And instead of being able to transition across another taxiway, they had requested that I take them off into the unimproved areas outside of the threshold area in the construction vehicles. I was afraid that the surface might not support them and we might create some damage or a stuck vehicle. So that was when I used unable and requested that another procedure be proposed for mitigating impeding traffic at the time.
It's either, it's a bold call because it's either that or airplanes have to avoid a vehicle that's not where it's upright. So
right.
Definitely a good.
I didn't want to be stuck inside the RSA, and now this runway is unusable.
Right, exactly right. Yeah, excellent call. So John, on the controller's side of the house, when you hear the words unable, can you kind of walk everybody through what your mindset is and what happens when they hear that?
Yeah, we're usually like, "Oh, come on," right? Like we're like, "Oh, all right." No, the big thing with unable, it's painful for everybody, right? Probably when I say it too, but I think at the end, if we're giving you a clearance or an instruction you can't comply with, unable is absolutely appropriate. But what I would like to hear as a controller is like something with the unable, because I'm just going to ask you, well, okay, well, what can we do, right? So you're like, hey, no, I'm not able to take, that intersection departure. I just want to go full length. That works a lot better than just unable. And I'm like, because I'm going to be like, okay, well, help me out here. Help me help you. How can we make this situation a little bit better? So usually if there's an unable involved, not a big deal. We'll accommodate as necessary. And as Brad brought up one thing, I think might be a little bit misconception of pilots, but not totally off. So if you flew into the Dallas airport, like my colleague from the South there, or up here in Philly, I work in Philly, so a small little bug smasher, and it makes our job a little bit complicated, right? We're usually dealing with big heavy jets that are moving kind of quick, but we're planning for that, right? And we're trying to take appropriate action, and we might be talking a lot, talking fast, right? We tend to do that, but it doesn't mean we're rushing you, right? And we don't want you to be rushed. And if we're putting you in a situation that's not working for you, you got to let us know. That unable is good. Or if we're like, hey, I need you to go fast, like I know that clearance is pretty common on the final. I want you to go as fast as you can, get you to the runway. You're like, hey, I got to slow up sometime, right? I got to get the landing gear and I got to dirty up the aircraft to land safely. It's just let us know, right? Big point here is controllers are not pilots. right? Most controllers aren't a pilot, and they don't understand some of those complexities that you're dealing with on the flight deck. So just keeping that in mind. But I promise you, if you're coming into a busy airport, we're not rushing you. We're planning for it. We're doing the best we can. It sometimes makes our job a little bit harder, but that's okay because we're there to do the hard job for you.
Yeah, 100% agree. While I've got you and you're warmed up, John, I want to talk about readbacks in terms of requirements for mandatory readback. What scenarios necessitate that? Would you mind enlightening our attendees, and then perhaps afterwards we can talk to Jillian and Brad and Mary about how that applies in their ops. But yeah, can you just walk our attendees through mandatory readbacks and what that's about?
Absolutely. So I mean, the easy one, right? Everybody, we need a runway hold short readback, right? There's no option about it. Need to hear it. You're going to hold short of a runway, and that's for a good reason, right? We're going to make sure that you are clear that we need you to hold short of that surface. So that's really important. Controllers, there's a couple other rules in the handbook that controllers might ask you for a readback that maybe you were unaware of. Sometimes controllers ask for the runway assignment if you didn't give it back when we gave you the IFR clearance or taxi instructions. Roger or Wilco might not be good for some places. Not all of them are the same, but some places may actually reach out, and depending on their culture or how they have this system set up there, they may say, hey, I need you to tell me what runway that we're going to. Even though there's only one, we're still going to ask for it. So, and then if we're doing, depending on the pilot, right? If it's a student pilot or maybe a pilot that was unfamiliar and you're like, hey, I need a little extra help, they might say, hey, okay. And I'm giving you some progressive taxi instructions. I might ask you to read it back, right? And say, hey, do this. I can tell you controllers, a readback is like a controller's blanket. It makes us feel really good that Roger or Wilco, nervous face real quick, and we're going to watch real hard, right? We don't really love that. We like that little blanket, that nice, secure feeling that you told us back what we told you, and we're all playing on the same sheet of music right now.
No, I like that. I don't think I've ever heard that analogy, but it makes perfect sense. Jillian, I'm gonna go Jillian and then Brad to perhaps talk about mandatory readback and the importance from the pilot's perspective.
Sure. I mean, I really like that blanket analogy. I think that goes both ways, and that it's also really good as a pilot to, be hearing exactly what you're saying and to understand that all your transmissions are being received. And, those words that you've mentioned, like, Wilco, Roger, they really don't mean a whole lot when it comes right down to practicality and what that's really doing for you. So if I ever were to use any of those words or even hear any of them on frequency, I'm also always listening for a follow-up to that. What is actually happening here, I think, is the question that's going through my head a lot of the time. But when it comes to what I'm reading back and, what makes me feel safe as a pilot when I'm reading back instructions, it's pretty much anything that involves how or where my aircraft is moving. I think that's a pretty good umbrella statement for what I'm going to read back to ATC.
To me, a readback is basically my opportunity to, put on a recorded line exactly what I understood was the instruction that I received. And, God help me if I ever run into a situation where, there was a question or a occurrence somehow or another. But that is the only opportunity that we have for the controllers to understand that we got their message and they understood it. It's very rare that someone reads back a incorrect instruction, that someone misinterprets an instruction, a valid instruction, reads back what they thought was something else, and the controller doesn't catch it. I mean, by far, the controller is going to catch something that is not correct. So that is your opportunity to confirm that what you heard and what you said are in fact what is expected of you. And if something does happen, your words are there, so there's no question what your understanding is. Air traffic controllers are amazing, but they are not mind readers, and they can't assume that you got the instruction correct the first time. At that point, they're reliant on their eyes and their ears to see what you're doing. And at that point, it might be too late to correct the situation. So correct it when you're doing your read back, and you'll save everybody a lot of trouble.
Right.
And Jamal, can I just add one thing to Brad's thing? So if as a pilot, if you read something back incorrectly and the controller misses it, it's a controller error. Then it's not a pilot error any longer, right? So the controller owns the responsibility to verify that the readback's accurate and correct. And if they don't, it's actually an error on the system or the controller as opposed to the pilot. So there's a little insurance for yourself there too, right? If you're reading that back as a pilot, then you kind of put the risk back on me and make sure you set it back right.
And I was insinuating that, but ultimately at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether it was the pilot's error, the controller's error. The important thing is to collaboratively avoid the error in the first place. But you're absolutely correct, though, in that, when it comes time, to investigate a situation, definitely how the readback was interpreted is going to be, a key piece of information determining what happened there. So, great point, John. Thank you.
No, thank you both for that. Mary, I'm curious to hear your thoughts, being that you have the unique perspective on readbacks and how it applies to your operation.
Well, for me, I probably read back more than what the controller really wants me to read back because we're not on that airfield near as much as the pilots are. So that, and again, the blanket analogy was awesome. So that reassurance that what I'm thinking, I was just told, and understanding as my path to get where I need to go has just been confirmed is very, very helpful. I do know, I don't know what kind of training pilots go through, but I know for us drivers on the airfield, there's only a few key things that they talk about the readback being required. And that may be something that I think should be expounded upon for those that are vehicle drivers out on the airfield, is to make sure that they really impress upon all of the, especially the newer drivers, that you just do that read back chronically. That way the controller knows you're paying attention.
Right. No, I completely agree. That's a great point.
Yeah.
With the time that we have left on this panel, I would like to ask a question for everybody. And that question is, if you could provide one suggestion that would help to improve pilot controller communications, what would that suggestion be? If you could provide one suggestion to improve pilot controller communications, what would that be? And I'd like to start with Jillian, and I'll go Jillian, Mary, John, and then we'll finish with Brad.
Honestly, I think we have, like what we've discussed through standard phraseology and readbacks, that's a great framework for really great communication between pilots and controllers. So really, I think one of the bigger keys to improving that line of communication is just to keep having, forums like this one and open dialogues among pilots and between pilots and controllers about, where things do go wrong, how we can be better about that. Because I think a lot of value comes from having that really open dialogue. And I've learned a lot from all of the panelists and, having this conversation. So I think continuing to do things like this is definitely going to help me as a pilot.
Thank you for that, Jillian. Mary?
And to follow along with Jillian, it's that relationship building between the people that are out moving about on that airfield and the controllers. I personally didn't learn that there was a pilot controller glossary until much later in my career. And then it was almost like miraculous that there was this handy dandy little guide that is out there. But a lot of that is working with the controllers. That relationship piece is huge for developing that standardization. There are some best practices that some folks out of the Minneapolis area do, and they do what's called a cab lab, and they have a conference room with a map, and they actually go out and do some practice runs of driving around on the airfield and the controller and them talking back and forth to develop that communication and education amongst themselves.
Awesome. Thank you, Mary. John?
Yeah, I think just like flying, communicating is a skill, and you can make it better. So give us a call, right? It doesn't have to be when you're just showing at the airport, right? If you're out flying around, get some flight following out there. The more you communicate back with us, the easier and more proficient you'll be as a pilot. And you remember, right? Student pilots, we like to hear about that. But remember, we have student air traffic controllers too, right? So if you're not getting what you need out of us, like, hey, maybe it might be a student that day and somebody sitting next to them, and prod them a little bit, like, hey, can you slow down a little bit? Or, hey, can you repeat that? Right? Those kind of things. But I think at the end of the day, the more you communicate with air traffic, the easier it'll be.
Excellent. Thank you for that, John.
Yeah, just to add to that, I was going to say that operating at controlled airports is a perishable skill. And I've done many flight reviews with pilots who avoid towered airports basically because it's been so long since they've done it that, it's to the point where they just don't feel they have those skills. And so, I encourage folks, to do it often, to, fly with other pilots, fly with an instructor. The minimum requirements to get your private pilot certificate, the requirement for controlled towered operations is minimal. I mean, it's the bare minimum. And so, make it a practice to get as much experience as you can so that, it's, every flight, and I still say this after 30 years, every flight's a learning experience, but, the more experience you can get under your belt, the better. And there are ways you can accelerate that experience. You can listen to air traffic control, even when you're not flying, is helpful sometimes. Visiting an air traffic control facility now that COVID is starting to ease things up. I know some facilities are allowing visitors again. So if you have that opportunity and you can visit the tower, that's a great way to talk to your local controllers and understand what their needs and desires are. And, basically to, focus on preparation so that, you can be prepared and go in knowing what to expect, and you'll come out a lot more successful.
Excellent. Thank you for that. With that, we're going to close panel 2. And before you guys leave, I would like to say a big thank you to Jillian, John, Brad, and Mary for your insights today. If the attendees are anything like myself, I'm sure that they enjoyed it. And thank you for taking the time to be with us here today.
Thank you, Jamal.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jamal. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
Thanks. Have a good one.
So what we're going to do now is show another video from our non-towered pilot simulator series entitled VFR Traffic Pattern.
This 3-part series focuses on communicating effectively and operating safely in the non-towered environment. In part 1, we discussed basic radio communications. Here in part 2, we look at VFR operations, departing the airport and entering the traffic pattern. In part 3, we'll cover mixed VFR and IFR operations. Let's observe several critical phases of flight: approach, landing, and departure. We'll see that improper execution could result in unsafe situations. We'll also explore some best practices for operating in the traffic pattern and on the surface at non-towered airports. These best practices will help improve safety.
Westland traffic, Warrior 6057 Bravo, left downwind runway 20, touch and go, Westland.
I haven't heard anyone on frequency, so I'm just going to go directly into a right base. Westland traffic, Baron 4079 Whiskey, 2 miles northwest of the field. We'll be entering a right base for runway 20, Westland.
Westland traffic, Warrior 6057 Bravo, left base, runway 20, Westland.
Westland traffic, Baron 4079 Whiskey, right base, runway 20, Westland.
What is that guy doing? Twin traffic at Westland, Warrior 6057 Bravo, turning north. Didn't you see us? Westland is left traffic. Twin traffic at Westland, Warrior 6057 Bravo. Do you copy?
Where did that Piper come from? I never heard them. Oh, I'm on the wrong frequency. Westland traffic, this is the Baron on final 20. Sorry, we forgot to switch frequencies.
That was a close one. Westland traffic, Warrior 6057 Bravo's on final, runway 20, Westland.
Geez, I wonder what that was about.
Do you see the Warrior anywhere?
I don't see her. She's probably a ways out there.
Westland traffic, Cessna 7241 kilos, taking off Westland.
Do you see a Cessna?
I don't see anything on the runway.
There he is. He's on the other runway. Westland traffic, Warrior 6057 Bravo, going around runway 20, Westland.
This is not an unrealistic situation. In fact, you may have experienced something similar yourself. Let's discuss best practices when flying at non-towered airports. The Warrior pilot did everything correctly, making proper radio calls and flying the correct left-hand pattern for the airport. The Baron pilot, however, was taking a shortcut. Approaching the airport, he entered a right base to save time, even though he knew the runway had a left traffic pattern. Taking shortcuts may lead to hazardous outcomes. When flying the pattern, look for traffic and check field conditions. Know how you will enter the pattern well before your arrival as part of your flight planning. Refer to the chart supplement for official information about current traffic patterns at both departure and arrival airports. Left pattern is standard, but some airports have a right pattern for certain runways that will be noted as RP on the sectional chart and specified in the chart supplement. The Baron pilot was communicating on the wrong frequency. Always verify that you are communicating on the correct frequency. The Skyhawk pilot did not listen to radio calls nor state his departure runway, which led to 2 aircraft converging on intersecting runways. Be sure to listen to the radio for traffic. Verify and announce the runway you are using. At a non-towered field, all runways may be in use. Don't fixate on your runway. Traffic on final approach has the right of way. Always check for traffic and make a radio call before crossing a runway holding position marking, also known as the hold short line. When operating on the surface, during takeoff and while landing, conversation should be limited to safety critical information. Observing these best practices improves safety for everyone. Click on the Resources tab. There, you will find several safety resources.
And we're back to start our third panel. And the focus of this panel is going to be safety of the surface in the primary flight training environment, surface safety in a primary flight training environment. So at this time, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is Brenna Daniel. And Brenna is a CFI and a CFII who was instructed at Elizabeth City State University, which is a Part 141 program since May of 2021. She is also the flight school safety officer and a check instructor. Brenna, welcome. We also have Martine Missy, who's also a student at Elizabeth City State University. Martine does have his commercial pilot rating and is currently a student at ECSU as well, working towards his flight instructor certificate. Also, we have Alex Gertson. Alex is the Director of Airports and Ground Infrastructure, leading NBAA's airport safety, access, and advocacy initiatives. He is currently serving as the industry co-chair of the FAA Surface Safety Group. Alex is a commercial instrument-rated pilot with over 20 years of experience. Alex, glad to have you here.
Thank you, Jamal. It's a privilege to be here.
And lastly, we have Joe Forresto from the FAA Flight Standards Office. He works in the General Aviation and Commercial Division. Joe is an ATP, a CFI, a former airline pilot and flight engineer, and is a current instructor. Joe, welcome.
Thank you.
So I don't see Martine and Brenna, so we're going to proceed with just us three in the meantime, and maybe they will join us here in a few minutes. So what I'd like to do, Joe, is start by asking you a rather complex question, because you're here in the FAA with us and you touch a lot of different things as it relates to flight standards and training. So we all know that ATC controls the aeronautical environment, and flight standards takes care of the teaching element. So in your estimation, Joe, is there something that we can all do together to help provide the CFI who is teaching a path to addressing any identified incident or accident causal factors, and then kind of promote that in their ground school instruction, so that each flight, we develop these scenarios that bring attention to that situational awareness? What can you tell us about that?
Yes, that's been a very big topic. Currently working with our other division within 800 to update the pre-flight planning actions, where you should identify the phases of flight that are involved in your trip, whether you're local, long distance, or what you might be doing. Then all the risks, and I emphasize ALL, all the risks that are associated with movement. Now, whether it be you start your pre-flight, and then you have to start your taxi, and then you have to get to the run-up area, et cetera. And then you have to plan your takeoff, see what's going on as far as traffic is concerned. Then you have to come up with the mitigations for that. Now, unfortunately, at this point, and I'm coming across this, I'm trying to help a lot with this, and I'm doing work with 630, but I'll explain that a little bit later on the pilot training handbooks, including the CFI handbook. Is that the CFIs really need to pay a lot more attention on what is flight ground school and what is ground school ground school. Now, what's the difference here? Well, how you operate on the ground, you have specific procedures. When you operate in the air, they focus on maneuvers. And one of the biggest maneuvers you have, what we're concerned about, is surface safety right now. Yeah, we do have our issues with near mid-air collisions and other issues working with non-towered airports. We've got something new coming out in the AC 9066 on that. But we have to focus on the CFI taking the responsibility that the young lady at the beginning of this whole symposium said, you'll never have all the answers. And when you think you have all the answers, I've added to that, it's time to burn your certificate because you're looking for trouble, Now, I've been doing this over 52 years, turning fuel into noise. And unless you commit to being an instructor, you don't walk around like Chuck Yeager and he crashed 3 times. You have to be an instructor. You've got to convey information specific to the operation and be honest to say, you know what? I don't have the answer on that. Let's go look it up. And if you can't find the answer, you can always send us an email and be sure I get a lot of stuff and we can respond to it. So if I would take this all the way down to the bottom line, that all flight schools, chief instructors, checking instructors must say to themselves, I'm here to teach. I'm not here to build flight hours to go fly for an air carrier. And the person that is depending on me is that student I'm looking across at, or a certificated pilot. Typically, a G8 driver is maybe 40, 50 hours a year. That's nothing. That's not enough to keep skill, knowledge, and proficiency. So moving on past that, when the flight review comes up, there's a lot of emphasis needs to be placed on keeping them safe, because if that pilot is safe, then the people on board their aircraft are safe, then people on board those aircraft within the same airspace that they're in are safe. And let us not forget about those houses and ballparks and schools underneath those airplanes. Okay. With that said, I'm going to give it over to Alex if he's ready.
Thank you, Joe. I couldn't agree more. I think it's important that we all work together to get the information out and to coordinate as we discuss the runway safety challenges.
And Martina Brenda, do you have anything to say to follow up to that?
Yes, Jamal. I also want to apologize for any potential technical difficulties. I also want to say thank you on behalf of Elizabeth City State University as a student, and additionally Brenna as an instructor, for the opportunity. But I want to really agree with Joe's point here that, you know, it's really nice to have an instructor communicate when they do not know something. And it makes me feel more confident in them as a student to know that they're not misleading me with information that might not be accurate. But more importantly, understanding that what we learn on the ground is what's applicable to the ground and its reality. So what we learn in even just our local area applies also to unfamiliar airports, not in our local area. So it's really important to be proficient and train on these ground topics regardless. And I think that, you know, as pilots, we have tools, standardized procedures, but experience is really the key to making sure that accidents don't happen.
No, that's a great point. And, you know, when we're talking about that on a completely different vein, we talk about, you know, flight training environment. We touched on that quite a bit. But Alex, I'm curious if there's unique surface safety related aspects that are germane to business aviation that you'd like to touch on for our attendees today.
I'm glad that you asked, Jamal. Business aviation encompasses quite a diverse number of operations, aircraft, and pilots. So as you can imagine, it ranges anywhere from 2 pilots flying complex jets that are going international or long distances, to single pilot operations. And in fact, a lot of the business aviation operations are single pilot operations, flying aircraft as small as a single engine Cirrus to Barents, King Airs, PC-12s, and a number of other aircraft. So we operate at a very diverse number of airports, both from large hubs like Atlanta and Charlotte and San Francisco, right, to small airports that are non-towered, that have shorter runways, but still could be with complex geometries like Flying Cloud that we were talking about earlier. So we have to be prepared for all these different situations and to be cognizant of the challenges that are ahead. Sometimes we might be flying into the same airport, but it has multiple FBOs. One FBO is on one side, another FBO is on another side. So what we've done in the past may not work. We have to consistently brief our routes to and from the runway to make sure that we're familiar with each iteration that we are using that particular airport in the example of different FBOs.
No, those are all good points. And I was wondering if Joe had anything to add to that from his perspective in a GA and a commercial division.
Well, with respect to the operation of more complex aircraft, and with all the new avionics systems that are coming on board, they are becoming very complex aircraft, and they're very distracting. The ability for the business world getting part of, and most of the heavy stuff, talking about jet turbine-powered aircraft, they usually go to a SIMCOM, Flight Safety International. I helped stand up Part 142 when it was first born, and the whole concept there was to have a syllabus that would address the specific requirements for the type of flights they're going to be doing. So even in the air carrier, we had special airport usage. And I was 00 qualified, meaning I could land in 00 weather conditions. But there are requirements that you had to have so many approaches, so many per month to do that. Otherwise, you couldn't do it. Same thing goes on with the safety of operation in various types of airports. If you operate into a Pudunk little airport, it's got one runway, the next thing you know, you go into a JFK type airport, you got a problem. So you don't want to take that on unless you do a lot of work. And the videos we work on, the SME, on those videos for the surface safety group, is to check out the chart supplement. But in addition to the chart supplement, there's a phone number there. You can call the airport manager and say, yo, how you doing over there? I got to talk to you. You know what I'm talking about? Excuse the French. Anyway, I know Alex laughs at me. The other side comes to the this other system that's out now called FAA Weather Cam. It's a phenomenal system, but you can jump right into the single stop shopping method of getting what you need. I helped stand up ADDS, and the thing is, it's all about weather. Too many pilots focus on the weather. Flying the weather is a guesstimate. Knowing where you're going, that airport is like that 24/7. So you need to know the environment you're going into. And if you haven't been in that environment, don't do it. Be sure you get some pre-training before you do that. Otherwise, you are going to get caught short. All right. So just to add with Alex, I think the business world, thank goodness to the aviation insurance industry, which I was also on Wall Street for a while, working as aviation risk analyst, and we're working out something right now, and I'm going to get Alex involved, that there might be a discount there if they participate in these videos. And right away, money talks, nobody walks, right? And they get very interested in what else are they talking about. We're going to increase the syllabus on what they need to know. All right, it's just the CRM. We want to focus just having an oversight audit on safety. Are they doing what they're supposed to be doing to keep everybody, not only within that fuselage, healthy and safe, but everybody outside that fuselage, healthy and safe? That's it.
No, Joe, I like that. I'm glad you said that because it kind of leads nicely into my next question, where you were talking about the habit patterns in terms of going from small airports to big airports and kind of getting yourself trained up and developing that methodology. I want to pivot to Martine and Brenna and ask a question because Martine, you're a certificated pilot and you got plenty of hours, but you're still a student, right? So from your perspective, are you aware, do you see any methodologies that could assist in helping CFIs focus on that goal of instruction in order to address any risks that you see associated with surface and flight operations and, you know, really help to mitigate some of the instances and to have students and certificated pilots be better equipped to avoid potential accidents? What can you tell me about that?
You're correct. And I do not have many hours in comparison to, say, other pilots in the National Airspace System. However, from my experience alone flying to Class Charlie airports, with an instructor or without an instructor, I can already come up with a few ideas of my own. The first thing that comes to my mind is really crew resource management. I think as a student, whether I'm flying solo and that single pilot resource management, just using everything I have on board to make sure I'm doing everything properly, versus having someone like Brenna by my side helping me throughout, you know, hey, I didn't catch that read back. Yeah, did you catch that? You know, or this is an airport I might be a little unfamiliar with. She can actually give me some of her personal experience and say, hey, when I flew into here, I had this experience. I'm familiar with kind of the ground operations, surface operations. So I think primarily what comes to mind is crew resource management. I think that's a method that we use throughout majority of our training at all big flight schools, including Elizabeth City State, where we work as a team. So we're visually and verbally calling out what we see. We're using our checklist. But that's really what comes to my mind as a student. But I really think this question should be more passed off to Joe or Alex, get their 2 cents.
Well, yeah, I definitely want to hear Joe's input. But Brenna, before we have Joe's input, I wanted to see if you had anything on the CFI side of the house that may help kind of supplement that answer a little bit.
Yes, sir. So the first thing that will come to my mind is our chief flight instructor says all the time is his first goal for us as instructors is to bring the airplane and the student back safely. And the second goal is instruction. So obviously, you know, we're on that flight to teach the student. But, you know, if you have some kind of incident or something happen, then that's, you know, that's not beneficial to anybody. So can be difficult as an instructor to balance that, you know, your situational awareness. How much time do you spend inside the cockpit talking to the student? How much time do you, you know, scan for traffic? And kind of like Martine was saying, both of you working as a team to make sure that you're not missing anything, that you're taking in all the factors around you and making sure you operate as safely as possible.
Excellent. Joe, anything to add?
Yeah, I'm also an adjunct professor at State University in their aviation group, and one of the courses I teach is CRM, along with a ton of other ones. But the bottom line comes down to the CRM aspect. You know, we've all heard the term scan, interpret, and control. Can you really define what the scan means? Are you talking about look at the digital instruments, the SIC pack, or do we have the G1000, 750s, all this other fancy television navigation stuff that's out there? Or does scan also mean you have to check from the trailing edge of the left wing around to the front and back out to the right side of the wing? Something I learned in the Air Force. You scan whether you're IFR, locked in the cloud, or not. And that includes everything around you. That's part of being safe. And before you take off to go turn fuel into noise, you want to make sure where you're going, what's the weather going to be, what's your deviation airport, because to deviate is to graduate, which is a home run, because you don't have to take on the risks that could be there. We have far too many this year alone, aircraft running out of fuel, going VFR to IMC. The NTSB still lists VFR to IMC conditions as one of the major contributors to aircraft accidents. But bottom line, CRM, crew resource management, whether it be single pilot, multiple pilot, and or with the flight crew on board, which means includes the flight attendants and also the maintenance personnel. You can all communicate on the same level. If you don't understand something, question it. Okie dokie doesn't hack the mission. So bottom line is we've got to get together. And I think a little bit later down the line here, I'm going to introduce something we're already doing with 630. It's going to help CFIs a lot. But again, we have to communicate to graduate. And if we don't do that, stay out of the airplane.
Yeah, and I like how you touched on the variegation in equipage, where you talk about, 6-pack steam gauges versus what you call television, the multifunction display, avionics, things of that nature, G1000. So I want to ask Alex a question, because in his organization, his operators have a wide variety of aircraft. They have, varying levels of equipage automation, lots of different skill levels and pilots operating them. How does equipage or automation kind of help during surface operations in your estimation?
Jamal, I'm glad you asked. I think automation helps dramatically with surface navigation, situational awareness, especially since we operate in business aviation during poor weather. I was just doing a medevac flight to Columbus, Ohio last week, and we were maneuvering on the surface in very thick fog. And this reminded us of the Tenerife incident because we couldn't see other aircraft. The controller was asking for aircraft positions. And of course, as the scenario would have it, there comes a vehicle. We were talking about in the previous panel, there's a service vehicle somewhere on the airport, and they're confused about their position. And so having a display where we can see, be situationally aware of other aircraft, where we are, where they are. Unfortunately, that vehicle did not have ADS-B, so we couldn't see them. But ultimately, we knew that as we were taxiing out to look out for them, and we felt comfortable that the controller ultimately asked for their position, asked them to exit to a known location before we received our takeoff clearance. But all of that was very helpful. And again, to your point that we fly very diverse mix of aircraft, even if the aircraft doesn't have an MFD, one of the advanced avionics suites installed, we can do a lot on our iPad now with applications like ForeFlight and Garmin Pilot, many others that provide a georeferenced moving map display. And I would encourage everyone to use that. If it costs a little bit extra to get an iPad that has cellular so that you have GPS position, or you purchase one of the ADS-B receivers that has GPS that feeds the iPad, that's all money well spent and a great contribution to increasing safety. It's important that we practice using that with an instructor so that we're not heads down. If we can mount it somewhere that we're looking heads up, become very familiar. We've talked about also using automation to mark our route in previous panels. So all those tools are really important. And from my perspective, our members flying Gulfstreams and Falcon jets and others that have moving map displays down to those who might be flying their Cessna 182 on business using the iPad, all can greatly benefit from the automation. All the work that a variety of companies have put into developing those digital resources to having valuable situational awareness on the surface.
No, those are great points, Alex. And I want to get Brenna and Martine's take on how they fold automation into the training process and what the methodology is for kind of folding that in safely. Brenna, would you like to kind of add your thoughts on that?
Sure, thank you. So we do have a few 6-packs, but our primary training planes for the more advanced students, especially in instrument, are G1000s. So, like Mr. Gertson mentioned, they have the moving map. We make sure that instrument students are told to zoom that in. So they don't have necessarily the paper diagram that a private student would have, but they have the digital one that they can use to maintain their situational awareness and keep up with where they are on the flight deck. But then also like the point that was brought up about really that's something that should be used when you're stopped, or maybe slow the airplane down and stop it on a taxiway if you're not sure. You don't want to have your head down and be too focused on that when the aircraft is moving. So it's a good tool, but it's also important to kind of balance that back and forth.
Excellent. Martine, anything to add to that?
Yes, sir. So as Brenna mentioned, automation and the technology we have is most definitely an aid. In my words, I would say it's a privilege, mainly because this technology didn't exist long ago. However, going through private training, I can recall not using it for flight, not being depended upon or used at all. I was told to stay farther away from technology and take it as not as a crutch, not as a saving grace, but to have it as almost like a bird's eye view. If you need a geo-reference of where you are, I believe some of these applications require internet or some kind of cellular connection. So those of us that can't afford that or do not have that, that's okay, because our main concept is to visually scan outside, look for traffic. However, it definitely is an aid to cross-reference with what I see inside on my iPad versus outside. But something that stuck with me most definitely since private and instrument onto commercial has been that iPads have batteries, they die. So more often than not, you might run into a scenario where it will be either low on battery, will fail on you completely, or you may forget it at home. We typically, we might do a pat down check, make sure, okay, I've got my iPad for my flight, but in the case that you lose it, you kind of have to understand that it's not required, but we've definitely become a little bit over reliant over time. But here at Elizabeth City State, I believe Brenna has even taught me, don't use this as your primary means for navigation, have this as a reference. Do not, rely on this iPad continuously, and take it as a privilege. The MFD is extremely, it's very comfortable. It's nice to have something like that next to you to show hotspots and taxiway diagrams and all the information you would need as a pilot. However, we already have had these resources before this technology was invented. So I just want to say that it's most definitely an aid for situational awareness, and I enjoy using it as a pilot. And I think that we can all understand that the concept is still to visually see and avoid traffic, not become overly reliant on this technology.
Martine, those are great points. I completely agree with you. Even on top of your iPad dying, even if it's fully charged, you leave that thing in the sun and don't have it cool down, and watch how fast that warning comes up that says, oh, I'm hot and I'm going to take a nap. And then you're done, right?
Yeah.
So use the resources that you have in the aircraft to navigate and communicate. And then, like you said, that is not a primary instrument, but you use it as an aid, whether it's to verify your position that you already, if you have your DME or your VORs dialed in, or however you're navigating with your primary instruments, and then you verify with that. So if that iPad does go down, you don't miss a beat. You already knew what course and heading you were flying. You already knew what waypoints you were going to hit. All those things are set. So you brought up some fantastic points, and I'm sure a lot of our attendees, if not all of them, can relate to. Joe, did you have anything that you wanted to add to this topic?
Yeah, I just happen to love the idea that Martin used the word as an asset. The best asset, that cockpit, is you. And when everything goes out to lunch, the airplane is still there and it's still flying. The wings are still there. You're still flying. So you get back to basics. And we had to put out a SAFO about 3 years ago that in the air carrier world, it's mandated that the pilots during training must hand fire the aircraft and do some other stuff like, do they remember what a VOR was or is, or however you want to look at it? I had a gentleman call me, he took off with his 182 that's fully glass. And the next thing you know, his GPS went out to lunch and declared an emergency. He came back in, he called me up, he says, Joe, we got to go back to VORs. I said, no kidding. So that said, never leave what you learned first, because what you learned first can help you get to the last line. So that said, it's all one item. You just don't take one over another. Okay, so that's just, and I love the fact that these iPads, my iPad, one of 3-4 years old, I've been changed. Battery went out to lunch yesterday afternoon. Oh yeah, really? I went over to Apple. A few $100s later, I got a new system. Hallelujah, right? But that happens in the air. You're going to go, no, you're not going to do that. You're going to say, oh, well, done. So you tell ATC, take off the G. I'm now a basic IFR airplane, VOR direct, period, and go from there. But you need to relax with this stuff, okay? Because the airplane doesn't know that it's doing something different. So that's it. Thanks.
All right, thanks for that, Joe. I want to ask Brenna a question as it relates to teaching, since you've been doing a lot of it. Is there a specific pattern, or how do you teach students to safely navigate in the airport environment? Do you have specific methodologies or tools that you use for your students? What is your approach?
Well, I'd say the biggest danger of ground operations is that people get so focused on the flight that they kind of forget ground safety at all. They'll kind of be rushing to, go do the run up, go hold short of the runway and get their takeoff clearance. So a lot of that stuff can go out the window. So one of the things I try to teach, especially to newer students, is, slow down, be thorough, make sure that you're hitting every item on your checklist. And like I'm sure it's been a big theme today is situational awareness, making sure that you have the full picture. Even, so you get in the plane, the engine's not even on yet. Once you turn it on, you start hearing the radios. And though you're not ready to go yet, you can start building a mental picture of, okay, I just heard somebody ask for a taxi clearance back towards the ramp. So I know that if I'm ready in the next, few minutes, I'm going to have to watch out for that guy coming back in. There's always wildlife at a lot of smaller airports, especially that you can be worried about on the ground. So just, having your eyes up, being active with, new information coming in on the ground is really important. Another thing is, after let's say you get that taxi clearance, you're taxiing out, you look down and you realize that you didn't switch your fuel to both. You thought, you have it on the wrong tank, and you didn't switch it to the correct position. What I see a lot of new students especially do is try to, reach down, mess with something, the airplane's still moving. And also actually maybe more with the advanced students, I see this because they kind of know how to taxi, they know where they're going, and they'll start trying to multitask. And so I'll, kind of pop the brakes and say, no, we gotta, if you want to do that, it's either important enough that you can stop and do it now, or it's not important enough and you need to wait until we're at the run-up area and you can take care of it then. So it's, especially, when you get more experience, it's easy to make those little slips of kind of cutting corners. Like in the video we saw before, there was the Baron that cut to the right base. That's probably a very experienced pilot, somebody that, really knows how to fly and has a lot of experience. And they just kind of said, oh, let me just take the shortcut. And that caused problems for people. So in flying, but especially on the ground, that can be an issue as well. So, make sure all your checklist items are done before you ever start to move. If you catch something, wait till the run-up area to cover it. Taxi speed is a big thing I see with people. The more you taxi, the more you kind of the speed starts to creep up a little bit. People start zooming a little bit. So I say, all right, Dale Earnhardt, calm down there and get it back under control. But especially with instructors, we can kind of get complacent from the right seat of, all right, this is a commercial student. They know what they're doing. And we'll, be kind of just looking out the window or not paying attention to them. And, things can take a turn without you expecting it pretty quickly. So I would encourage instructors to, prioritize ground operations just as much as they do flight operations.
Excellent. I want to have Martina weigh in from the student side. So, Brenda just mentioned a whole bunch of things on the instructor side that she likes to kind of bring home for her students. But are there things that you see on the student side that can be emphasized during training to help prevent not only surface safety incidents, but runway incursions, things of that nature?
Yeah, Jamal. I think Brenda had some great points there. I think most importantly is that I was often told, whether this was Brenna or other instructors, that every flight is not going to be the same. We have the privilege of operating at a control airport, meaning that we might be accustomed to the same taxi instructions every other flight or every flight, and we tend to get complacent. There are times where we put on the headset and we just expect to hear what we want to hear, but more often than times, that might not be the case. And I think keeping it simple is the biggest way that Brenna as instructor has helped me, is that, you're looking outside, you shouldn't be looking down at your feet, worrying about how your feet are positioned and whatnot. Make sure all of these things should be checked before that airplane starts moving. And just emphasizing that the safety of ourselves as students is important. We're paying a lot of money and we're using time to get to where we want to be in our career. Our instructors, being an asset for us, and they're doing what they can to help us. So emphasizing that we want to be safe for ourselves, make sure our instructor has their sanity intact as well, and just, operate safely. We have these set standardized procedures in place, so, follow them. The taxiways and runways at airports are not the same as the road. So I think that as a student, being reminded that not everything is going to be what you expect it to be on your toes. And I think Joe had a great point earlier where he was saying that, we want to be mindful of what's underneath us. These are the communities that we live in, people that we know. And it all starts from the moment we start moving on that taxiway or that ramp. And I think instructors need to emphasize that students, so even myself, that we need to be thinking ahead of the airplane, not letting the airplane think ahead of us. So on the ramp, thinking about not just the configuration of the aircraft, making sure that, fuel selector is in the right spot, but what is my next step as I approach the next runway? Do I know where I'm going? Do I know where I am? I think those are just very simple things. Talking about it may sound vague, but it's very simple and it goes a long way in preventing runway incursions. And then just being calm with the student, I think the biggest thing that they can also emphasize is that, speak up if you are nervous about something, if you didn't fully understand something that ATC said, or you as the instructor said. Scenario-based training. So if we're operating at a non-towered airfield and Brenna wants to throw a few scenarios at me, she can test my knowledge in the moment while I'm operating and taxiing that aircraft on, hey, what should I do if this scenario were to arise to prevent a runway incursion at a non-towered field, for instance, doing a 360-degree turn, scanning for traffic in the, that pattern. That's just one example I can think of off the top of my head, but those are just some things that come to mind.
No, and those are all great things. I'm glad that you're bringing them up, and it kind of leads us into our next talking point, because when you're doing those things in the first panel, and I bring this back here a little bit because I want to hear this group's opinion on the same thing. In the first panel, we talked a lot about airport signage, diagrams, whole short lines, things of that nature. And I'm curious to hear what this group thinks, especially because we have, Alex on the NBAA side, but then we have Martine and Brenna, who are operating in a special environment in Elizabeth City. If I remember correctly, it's Class Delta, and you've got Coast Guard traffic all over the place, right? So there's a good mix of there's a good mix of heavy traffic and what you guys are doing on top of, folks coming and going just because Elizabeth City is a nice place to come and visit. So I'm going to start with Alex, to get his take on the business side, but let's talk a little bit about how you leverage, the things I mentioned as it relates to signage, diagrams. Like, how do you leverage those things to really maximize your safety on the surface environment? So I want Alex to answer, and then we'll go Brendan, Martine, and then I'd like to have Joe to kind of bring us home from a FAA safety perspective.
I think it's a great topic. I'm glad we're jumping into it. I think it's important to start our surface safety with the pre-flight before we even get to the airport, to become familiar not with just the approach diagrams and route charts, but also with airport diagrams and surface charts, both for our airport of departure, arrival, as well as alternates, and look at taxi routes to and from the FBO and become familiar with that. It's also critical that not only do we look at the automation and we look at our situational awareness inside, but also obviously that we look outside and we pay attention to the markings. The FAA has done a lot of work in improving the signs at airports with LED lights and colors. There's now beads in the markings. About 10 years ago, there was a great initiative to add enhanced centerline markings at a huge number of airports around the country that help alert pilots that we're approaching hold lines. All those are really helpful cues to us. And so it's important that we use all of our resources to keep that situational awareness, but also that we're not rushing. I think that's an important point that's been made. And if something doesn't look right, if we look at our EFB or our moving map display and it is signaling one thing and we're seeing something else out the window, and that point to stop, query the controller. If you have a co-pilot, just discuss it with them before you go too far and make a mistake.
Excellent. We'll go Martine and then Brenna and then Joe.
Yeah, I think Alex had some great points. And here at Elizabeth City, we do operate with Coast Guard traffic. And, we do have our flight school aircraft operating at the same time. And although we may be a relatively simple airport to navigate and to fly into, I think as students, this goes for not just our airport, but other airports, being familiar with facility directory, signage, and markings is very critical, because the same markings we see at our airport, we will see at others. And something that's helped me, at least in private, my instructor had really told me that, hey, have you ever paid attention to the color? Red, yellow, different colors also kind of strike a nerve in our brain to say, hey, that's important. Whether a black may be a location sign, red may, mandatory. So small, simple things that are inside the script that we see as we navigate the ground. Once we kind of pay close attention to that, we kind of see just how important it is. And going back to looking at our diagrams, being familiar with taxiways, as a student, I remember how confident I felt when I could tell my instructor that I knew where we would be taxiing. Based on wind direction, I had an idea of what runway we'd be using. So just being familiar with the basics made me feel way happier and excited going to a flight lesson. And then therefore my instructor could kind of, amplify that enthusiasm and further motivate me and say, hey, that's a great job you did there. Let's take a look at, markings here. I like how you referenced what we spoke about in our ground lesson, how that pertains to our flight lesson. Like all of that had a huge impact on my confidence, and then led me to say, hey, I have to have this initiative as part of my pre-flight planning, that even though I operate at the same airport as a home base, I'm still going to be studying my markings. I'm still going to be, looking at airport diagrams and just wanting to have all the information I can get. Yeah.
Excellent.
I think kind of the highlight for me when I'm instructing, especially, newer students, more green students, is, that protected airspace that we've talked about a few times around the runway. So I kind of mentioned when I talked last about, how to come off the ramp, taxi, and that kind of thing. But, the end goal of that is to get to a runway, right? So that's kind of the holy ground of an airport, where, so you're probably closest to another airplane on the ground more than you ever are in the air. So, when you come to a runway, you really have to watch out for, whether it's controlled or uncontrolled, is there somebody coming off the runway? You're going onto the runway, is there somebody that's in the pattern on downwind that's going to be on final by the time that you're ready to go? So that's what I really look for in students, is that awareness I talked about of building the mental picture of where other traffic is, knowing the layout of the runway, like Martine talked about. When you see that hold short line come up, or those double dash lines on the other side, it's saying it's going to come up, do they pull the power back and slow down and, start to get ready to stop before the hold short line? Nobody wants to be that pilot that pulls out in front of somebody when they're on short final and causes an incursion or causes somebody to have to go around. So those are just kind of simple things that can slip through the cracks that you have to make it a habit. You have to build that habit of, being careful and really watching what's going on around you.
Joe, you want to bring us home on this question?
Yeah, first of all, Martin and Brianna, and of course, Alex, when I grew up, I wanted to be you. So with that said, we're going to move on a little bit here. Signage, what is it? Communications via paint, communications via metal, communications. Do you understand what it's saying? The NTSB, and not only that, but the automobiles, and Alice is going to like this one again. Leave your driving habits in the car, people. More people die every year running stop signs. So why should they stop at a runway hole? Why bother? It's only yellow. I mean, come on. That's not intuitive to stop. Red is stop, right? And yet they don't agree. Anyhow, communication, signage. Part of the ground school is to do and understand all that signage. We just added, I worked with NAFI, about 30 additional questions to the pilot written test on what signage means. Is it communicating? What does it mean to you? Okay. In addition to that, this part I'm getting around to here is that I have submitted about almost a year ago that there is going to be a new section of the CFI handbook on how to teach young folks like Martin how to effectively communicate with ATC. It's all on what's called the 711065. ATC is trained specifically for certain phrases. I worked with AMA 500 and 800 for 1 year out in Oak City, and we put this puppy together. And it don't bite. It's going to be a nice little puppy to pet. Thing is, you're going to learn what that ATC gentleman and young lady are saying to you. And here's a good technique. Repeat back the same words they just gave you. So where's the confusion? Unless you don't understand the verbiage. I also represent the United States to ICAO for the same problem. It's happening all over the world. So communication in signage, paint, words, you've got to know it. And that's all part of the ground school portions. So that said, I'm going to let that fly with what it is and obey it. And if you don't understand it, ask your CFI. And if they don't understand it, I also worked with a group of graduates from Purdue University who have a YouTube on ATC understanding. They communicate and you translate, and they will tell you if you're right or wrong. It's a pretty good technique to use on your own. Rather than watching a football game, you can listen to ATC talk to yourself. That's about it. Thank you.
Let's turn slightly and discuss a very important topic as it relates to surface ops and surface safety. And let's talk about distractions for a few minutes. I think we've heard a few different times, Brenna has said earlier, you shouldn't be looking down. If you're looking down, you're not looking up. Bridget in one of the earlier panels said the same thing. There's so many things, especially now, everything that's in our pockets is electrical and sends us messages and buzzes and makes noise. The plane is doing the same thing. How do you fight distractions to stay present in the moment to make sure that you are a safe operator in the surface environment? Because this entire symposium is surface safety centric, right? So I posed that question to the group, and we have a nice mix of young folks and older folks who might be able to answer this in different ways and coping mechanisms to avoid distractions, to stay engaged as a safe operator. So I would like to start with Brenna and Martine on what they do to minimize, mitigate, or otherwise dismiss distractions, and then go to Alex to see what happens on the NBA side, and then finish up with Joe. So Brenna, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, I like that you said dismiss because, to some degree, there's only so much we can do about distraction. I heard a story of an instructor who, when he was preparing a student for a solo, he would reach over behind him and pop the window open on takeoff. So he would see how they handled that. And if they, just kind of look over and oh, shoot, and ignore it, then he was like, that's a good sign that they're ready to go. You could have somebody talking on the radio that's distracting you. You could, drop a pen. Your temptation is to reach down immediately and get it. And really, you just have to dismiss those distractions, unless it's, you have to kind of have that little bit of a filter of, okay, this new thing came up. It's important enough. I need to address it, or I need to just let it go until I'm stopped and I'm able to handle it.
Martine, anything to add?
Yes, sir. Brenna had some great points there. I want to bring it back to early training days. I can recall that something that always bugged me in the back of my brain as a student pilot, even as a private pilot, is knowing who is going to be in control when a distraction arises, where even though I'm operating as PIC, the nerves might get the best of me. I might say, oh, are you going to take care of that? Getting carried away in emotions is very easy as a student, even as an adult. So learning how to manage emotions prior to a flight, handling distractions outside of the flight, the cockpit. Additionally, just re-emphasizing that safe aircraft control is key. Our instructor is going to be there in the event a distraction arises, it requires our immediate attention. Otherwise, we are operating the aircraft. And this kind of goes back to crew resource management of, we're operating as a team together. If something warrants our attention that is pertinent to the safety of the flight, we're going to handle that and make sure that we can, operate safely, somehow get around that distraction. But there are also great distractions that I want to mention our previous discussion on automation brings, those dings, those messages that we get on our iPad, even the message of our iPad heating up and then us kind of getting a little bit emotional about it, that can all influence our flight. And so that kind of goes back to, the safety and the purpose of the flight at hand is to kind of put those distractions aside. And as Brenna had mentioned before, I can say she is definitely an advocate for a dropping the pencil and saying, hey, why don't you pick that up for me? Versus me saying, you know what, I should be, we're going to take off here. I'm going to be focused on the aircraft in case, any emergency scenario, arises. And that's really Brenna testing my, not just my resource management, but my ADM, making sure that I can analyze the situation, detect if it warrants my attention, and then go from there. And I think every phase of flight, we can kind of imagine the distraction that we've had. But I just really like that you mentioned distractions, because that really drives home what we were talking about earlier with automation and just how much of a privilege that can be, but also a nuisance, because it can really be annoying sometimes.
These are all such great points. I think as humans, we're not great multitaskers, and we have to remember that. So when we're on the surface, it's really important that we don't give less emphasis to that. When we're flying, most of the time our cell phones won't have the signal, and so we're not getting the text messages, we're not getting the calls, but on the surface we are. So one of those things is how do you handle your cell phone when we're out of the airplane? We've just so trained ourselves that as soon as it buzzes, hey, who is texting me? Who is calling me? Is this important? And we can't have that reaction while we're taxiing. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll put my phone in a seat pocket, the seat next to me, so I don't feel it vibrating, I don't hear it. But then when I'm in the run-up area, if I'm doing a commercial flight, I need to communicate with a flight follower and whatnot, I'm able to take a look when I'm safely stopped and send those messages. I'm able to check the weather or anything else that you might want to do using that automation. Also, to emphasize safe use of our electronic flight bags, a lot of times we use the same iPad for work, for games, and for an EFB. I'm fortunate that I've been able to specifically designate 2 iPads that are my EFBs, and I specifically have notifications on those turned off. So I know it's not going to distract me. We also talked about radio calls and other things that might be happening. Sometimes something breaks, squelch, and it startles you. Just be aware of all that. I think we've talked about, Martina and Brenna, great techniques as to how can we prepare in our training so that when we are carrying passengers, flying ourselves on business where schedule matters, that we're prepared to handle those distractions, mostly to learn how to ignore them. I think that's really key.
Great points, Alex. Joe?
I just distracted you. What's the definition? Someone or something just stole your attention. You're committed to a phase of flight, called taxi, takeoff, initial climb, en route climb, level off, descent, approach, yada, yada, right on down till you get to the next coffee shop. You have to develop self-discipline. We could talk all day long about don't. But unless you can walk past that pizza and say that you're not going to take a piece of it, and in my case, a piece of apple pie, you're not mentally set to be 101% dedicated to the phase of flight you're in. Drop your iPad on the floor, I'll get it later. The kids start throwing up as you're in takeoff roll, I'll take care of him or her when we get airborne, I'll bring it back around. The dog starts barking, I keep flying. Thing is, you've got to be dedicated. I got my hands full like I'm praying. You got to dedicate yourself. And if you don't dedicate yourself, you ain't going to hold it together. So this is a matter of building. In the military, you build a resistance to fear. Go take over that bunker. Well, what are you, crazy? Well, in time, you learn to do that. Or roll over and take out that item on the ground. What are you crazy? In time, you learn how to do that. It's a matter of understanding what your focus is for the time that you're doing. And with that said, I think the training for CFIs to students and vice versa is maybe a little slap while they're flying and see if they look at you. Don't look at me. Fly the airplane. Because that is a distraction piece. Okay? So you have to be focused. So I'll let it go with that.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Joe. We're starting to get close to our end time, but I do have time for another question. So what I'd like to do is pose a question to each of the panelists. And the scenario is you're getting ready to get into an elevator with a person who is getting ready to go take their first lesson. And you had 1 minute in that elevator to tell them why surface safety matters to you and why it is so important. What would you say to that new student before they went on their first hop to really hammer home the importance of surface safety? So Brenna, you're in the hot seat because you're the instructor and your pitch should be the best. So I'm going to go with you, and then I'm going to go Martine, and then I'm going to go Joe and let Alex take us home.
Well, I would probably honestly focus in on kind of the early part, like even for the, when the pre-flight's happening, before the plane starts up, when you're watching out for the propeller. That's what I would be saying. Hey, you've never been around airplanes before, you're new to the ramp, be aware of there's an airplane next to you. If the tail light is on, that red tail light, it might be about to start up and it may be about to move. So be cognizant of, when you're a person walking around and you're not even in an airplane yet. You have to be kind of aware and realize that it's a new environment. Stay out of propeller arcs, even if it's your own airplane, make sure that you're kind of respecting that, like a loaded gun, that you're not, kind of getting in that area when you don't need to be. And then once the airplane is started up, to just take things slow, make sure that you're fully confident on controlling the airplane, that you're not rushing into anything. I think that's, like I mentioned initially, people are so focused on the flying part that they kind of rush through the other things and can put themselves into not great situations doing that. But to be honest, I feel like sometimes the newest students are the ones that are the most cautious and the ones that kind of, are looking around the most and doing that. So I feel like that would be a fun conversation to have.
I really like how Brenna basically just taught surface safety in a way while she was also giving the advice for propeller safety and that prop arc and making sure we're not walking near that. But from a student perspective, going back to when I was first going through training, it was that it's your time, your money, your energy that you're putting into training. So therefore make it worthwhile. Make sure that you're advocating for your own safety and other people around you. Emphasize that we're all trying to operate smoothly. Therefore, if you follow these set standardized procedures, study them, know them like the back of your hand, and just be attentive, whether that's on frequency, looking around the ramp for other aircraft, just be in the moment, think ahead of the airplane before it thinks ahead of you.
Joe, I'll give it to you. And then,
okay.
Yep.
Well, I like what Martin's had to say because it goes to what I was about to tell you. It's know your environment. If you don't know your environment, stay away from it. So if you're going to take an intro flight, that's one thing. You're coming out with your first flight, you're going to have some ground school. That ground school is what Brian was talking about. It will educate you on your environment, propellers, fuel trucks, all kinds of stuff going on. So knowing your environment will enable you to anticipate what you have to be on alert for. And it comes down to our situational awareness. Then as you grow and you proceed, you will learn more. And the bottom line, the whole thing is, you know what? Airplanes fly pretty well all by themselves, don't they? So with that said, all we have to do is manage the environment, manage the speed, manage the bank, pitch, etc., the 4 basic flight maneuvers. So again, you have to learn in steps and you emphasize the learning aspect before you take that next step. If you don't have that learning aspect or piece, don't take that next step because you're looking for trouble. That's it.
Thank you for that, Joe. Alex, I'll let you wrap us up.
As most of us are working to be as professional of a pilot as we can be, even if we stop at a private pilot's license. So ultimately, we want to be as proud of our professional pilot acumen in the air as we are on the ground. I think that I would want to instill that with the new student right away. I'm also in the process of learning to fly helicopters. And if your helicopter's on skids, you start flying right away. You take off on the ramps. In addition to managing all the challenges we talked about taxiing, you're also flying that helicopter. So the students should be aware that there's all kinds of flying machines, some that are on wheels, some that are already in the air on our taxiways and ramps. The challenge also is we want to be relaxed potentially as we pull off the runway, as we especially taxi onto the ramp, but that is also the time to continue to be very vigilant. We can have more threat of vehicles crossing when we are on the ramp, people moving in the way of the aircraft, potentially marshalers trying to get our attention, aircraft in close proximity that we're maneuvering around to make sure that we don't have any bent wingtips. So I would encourage the student to make sure that we're paying attention from the moment we start the engine to the moment that we shut down the engine, regardless of where we are, if we're in the air or on the surface.
Excellent. That is going to conclude panel 3. And before they sign off, I want to say thank you to Brenna and Martine, Joe, and Alex for dedicating your time and subject matter expertise. This was an awesome panel, and I'm sure everybody learned a lot. And thank you for taking the time to impart that knowledge.
Yeah, thank you for having us. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Jamal. We want to recognize you. It's been a very long day, and you've been moderating many panels, and just a great flow of conversation and energy that you brought to this webinar.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you,
Amen,
Jamal.
bro.
So with that said, we're going to transition from our panel to our closing remarks. And we have here with us this afternoon, Frank McIntosh. Frank is the FAA's Vice President for Air Traffic Safety and Technical Training. He and his team are responsible for proactively collecting and analyzing operational data to support risk-based decision-making and preparing air traffic controllers and technical operations technicians and engineers with the knowledge and skills needed to safely and efficiently deliver air traffic services. With that, I turn it over to Frank for some final remarks. Frank, the floor is yours.
Jamal, thanks so much. Really appreciate that. Wow, that's quite the bio. I got to thank my team for all that. Good afternoon, and thank you to everyone who participated in today's Surface Safety Symposium. As many of you are aware, but for those that are not, this is our 3rd-part series. We are really collectively trying to move our surface safety data in the right way, as well as the behaviors that we're seeing in the operational environment. Basically, we came here together today because we all share a deep commitment to safety, and our combined efforts can really help improve this metric and potentially save some lives. I would like to thank the FAA Administrator, Billy Nolan, the ATO COO, Tim Morrell, the FAA Deputy Associate Administrator for Aviation Safety, Jody Baker, as well as the NACA President, Rich Santa, for their opening remarks today. I believe they did a fantastic job of framing the importance of today and where we want to go as a community. We had some great discussions today on wrong surface and wrong surface alignments. I will say from my perspective, I see usually a wrong surface alignment 1 to 2 times a day. And oftentimes what puts us in success is the controllers and the pilots actually recognizing the environment and communicating with one another. We also talked about the surface event trends and as well as the prescribed phraseology. As a reminder, Roger is not a clearance. And finally, the surface safety in the flight training environments. All extremely impressive conversations. I want to thank everyone who presented as well as participated on the panels today, as well as everyone else on the call or on this Zoom call who participated with Q&A and basically just learned a little bit more about the operational environment we all espouse to have. Again, we welcome the discussion and the feedback as we collaborate as safety professionals. Together, we can all improve the system, and I thank you again. I look forward to hearing all the suggestions that were garnered from today's discussions, and I look forward to the future ones that we most assuredly will have. Once again, Jamal, thanks again for the time and the closing remarks, and I look forward to having this conversation again in the very near future. My best to everyone, and I hope everyone has safe flights out there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Frank. As everyone knows, the FAA's mission is to provide the safest, most efficient aerospace system in the world. And the reason why we're able to do that is because of engaged professional operators like our attendee today who show up to these events and do the best they can to be safe aviators. As mentioned earlier in the symposium, Wings credit is available for the symposium. And please take a look at our From the Flight Deck series on the FAA's YouTube channel, which provide an excellent first-person view of air and ground operations at a multitude of airports. And be on the lookout for pilot handbooks being created for each of those From the Flight Deck videos. With that said, Everyone have a great day, and we'll see you at the next event.